I am Paige, 30 years old, and a forensic accountant tracking hidden assets. I spend my days unearthing financial deceptions, but the greatest fraud I ever encountered was sleeping right beside me in our own bed. Just 1 hour after a grueling delivery to bring our beautiful daughter into the world, I looked at my husband expecting tears of joy. Instead, he coldly announced that he already had a 2-year-old son with another woman and would never acknowledge my child. He thought I would break down and cry. I just smiled and whispered, "Remember this moment." By the next morning, his entire arrogant universe would collapse. Let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever turned heartbreak into calculated justice. The fluorescent lights of the private maternity suite at St. Jude Hospital hummed with a sterile buzz. For 14 agonizing hours, I had labored through intense contractions to bring Emma into the world. My muscles ached with bone-deep exhaustion, and my skin was slick with cold sweat. The medical staff had finally cleared out, leaving behind the quiet beeping of the infant heart monitor. Emma was swaddled tightly in a hospital blanket resting against my chest, her tiny lungs filling with air in perfect peace. This was supposed to be the absolute pinnacle of my life, the exact moment where my husband and I wept with overwhelming gratitude. But the reality in the room was chilling. Bradley, my husband of 4 years, was not standing by my side. He was not stroking my hair or gazing down at the daughter we had planned for. He stood exactly 2 feet away from the hospital bed. Wearing a crisp designer suit, he looked more like he was waiting for a train than witnessing the birth of his first child. Both hands were jammed deep into his pockets. His posture was rigid, his jaw clenched tight. He aggressively avoided eye contact with me or the tiny bundle resting gently against my heart. The silence between us stretched on, growing heavier by the passing second. I adjusted Emma gently in my tired arms, ignoring the terrible sinking feeling in my stomach. "Bradley," I said, my voice hoarse from hours of pushing. "Come meet your daughter. Come hold Emma." He did not move toward me. He did not even flinch. Instead, he looked down at me with an expression of pure ice. His eyes were completely devoid of any warmth, empathy, or guilt. "I have absolutely no interest in holding a daughter," he stated, his voice flat and clinical. "I am not going to play the proud father today, Paige, because frankly, this was never part of my actual plan." I stared at him, my exhausted brain struggling to process the sheer cruelty of his harsh words. "What are you talking about?" I whispered, clutching Emma closer to my chest. Bradley let out a short, cynical breath. "I already have a son, Paige," he declared, each word hitting me like a physical strike. "His name is Leo. He is 2 years old, and he is the only child I will ever acknowledge. His mother, Brittany, is the specific woman I actually want. You were just a necessary stepping stone." The room seemed to spin, but Bradley kept talking, his voice steady and ruthless. He explained that climbing the corporate ladder required a respectable image. A wild bachelor with a younger girlfriend and a baby out of wedlock did not fit the conservative culture of his elite firm. My parents demanded a pristine professional facade, and my promotion depended on it, he continued. "You were the perfect candidate, Paige. A successful, stable professional. Marrying you gave me the flawless corporate image I needed. But now that my title is secure and my trust fund is fully vested, I am done pretending. I needed a male heir to satisfy my parents, and Brittany gave me that. You gave me a girl. I have no use for either of you anymore." In that exact moment, most women would have screamed. Most women would have dissolved into hysterical tears or begged their husband to look at their newborn child and find some humanity. But I was not most women. I was a forensic accountant. My entire career was built on maintaining emotional detachment while dissecting complex, deceitful situations. When presented with a discrepancy, I do not panic. I audit. I calculate. I build an airtight case. The physical pain of the delivery faded into the background, overridden by a chilling clarity. I looked at the man who had just admitted to using my life and my trust as a mere corporate prop. I analyzed him exactly the way I would analyze a fraudulent balance sheet. He was standing there, arrogant and untouchable, convinced his cruel honesty had completely broken me. He expected me to shatter right there in the hospital bed. He expected me to cry and beg. Instead, I took a slow, deep breath, feeling the steady heartbeat of my infant daughter pressing against my chest. I looked directly into Bradley's cold blue eyes, and I smiled. It was a quiet, highly calculated promise of absolute ruin. "Remember this moment, Bradley," I whispered softly, my voice completely devoid of any tears. "Remember exactly what you said to me right now." He scoffed, dropping a pre-drafted divorce settlement onto my hospital tray. He demanded I sign away my rights to our house and savings, or he would drop me and Emma from his corporate healthcare plan by morning. He announced that his mistress was moving into our suburban home tomorrow, then turned on his heel and walked out. The moment the door clicked shut, the facade of a helpless new mother vanished. I pulled my phone from beneath my pillow and dialed my brother-in-law, Devon. "The facade is down," I told him, my voice devoid of panic. "Initiate Protocol Alpha. Freeze everything." Bradley's reaction to my quiet warning was a harsh, dismissive scoff that bounced off the cold hospital walls. He truly believed he held every single card in this marriage. Reaching into the inner pocket of his tailored jacket, he retrieved a thick, neatly stapled stack of legal documents. He tossed them casually onto the rolling plastic tray hovering over my bed. The papers landed with a heavy, insulting thud right next to my plastic water cup. It was a pre-drafted divorce settlement. He had not just decided this today. He had been plotting this ambush with meticulous, cowardly precision, waiting for the exact moment I would be physically depleted and highly vulnerable. I glanced down at the front page. The terms outlined in bold print were nothing short of financial slaughter. Bradley was demanding full ownership of our sprawling suburban estate, complete control over our joint high-yield savings accounts, and the entirety of his stock portfolio. In exchange for surrendering my rights to the assets we had built together over 4 years, he was offering a laughably minimal monthly child support payment. It was a sum so insultingly low it would barely cover the cost of baby formula and basic utilities. He expected me to take this pathetic allowance pack up my newborn daughter and vanish quietly into obscurity, while he elevated his mistress to the status of a corporate wife. "You have until morning to sign those," Bradley stated, checking his luxury wristwatch as if he had a pressing engagement elsewhere. "I suggest you read them quickly, Paige. If my lawyer does not have your signature on every page by the time the sun comes up, I am logging into my employee benefits portal. With one click, I will immediately drop you and that infant from my premium corporate healthcare plan." The sheer malice of his ultimatum was breathtaking. In the United States, giving birth in a private hospital suite without premium insurance coverage meant facing astronomical, life-altering medical debt. He was weaponizing the healthcare system against a woman who had just undergone 14 hours of grueling labor. He fully expected the threat of a 6-figure hospital bill to force my hand. He thought the terror of financial ruin would compel me to sign away everything I had rightfully earned. And just so we are completely clear on the timeline, he added, a smug smile curling the corners of his mouth, "Brittany is boxing up her apartment tonight. I have a moving truck scheduled to arrive at our house tomorrow afternoon. She and Leo are moving into the master bedroom. I expect you to have your personal belongings cleared out by the end of the week. Do not make this difficult, Paige. You are a smart woman. Take the child support and find yourself a quiet little apartment somewhere affordable." He gave Emma one final dismissive glance, a look devoid of any paternal instinct or human decency. Then he turned on his heel and walked out. The heavy door clicked shut behind him, sealing me inside the dim, sterile silence of the maternity ward. For exactly 10 seconds, I sat completely still, listening to the rhythmic, reassuring sound of my daughter breathing against my chest. I looked at the intimidating stack of legal papers resting on the tray. Then the facade of the helpless, devastated new mother vanished entirely. The sheer audacity of his plan was almost comical. Bradley was a wealth manager, a man who moved millions of dollars for elite clients, yet he had fundamentally underestimated the woman he married. He had forgotten that a forensic accountant makes a living by dismantling financial illusions. I gently shifted Emma onto the pillows beside me, ensuring she was safe and comfortable. I reached beneath my mattress and pulled out my phone. My heart rate was steady. My mind was sharper than it had been in months. I dialed the number for Devin, my sister Rachel's husband. Devin was a brilliant, ruthless corporate attorney, a man who navigated high-stakes legal battles with terrifying efficiency. He was also one of my closest allies. The phone rang only twice before his deep, calm voice came through the speaker. He had been waiting for my signal. "The facade is down," I told him, my voice entirely devoid of panic or hesitation. He dropped the papers and gave me the ultimatum. "Initiate Protocol Alpha. Freeze everything." "Understood," Devin replied, his tone shifting immediately into tactical mode. "Did he threaten the medical insurance?" "He promised to cut it off by morning if I do not sign away the house and the joint accounts," I confirmed, flipping idly through the poorly drafted settlement. "He also announced that Brittany and her son are moving into the suburban house tomorrow afternoon. He thinks he has completely cornered me." I could hear the distinct sound of Devin typing rapidly on his mechanical keyboard. "He is operating under the delusion that he controls the board," Devin said. "I am submitting the filings now. Have you secured the local network access on his devices?" "Everything is routed exactly as we planned," I answered. "The moment his phone tries to authorize a change to the healthcare portal, it will hit our established roadblock. But we need to move faster on the asset lockdown. He is highly motivated to clean out the cash reserves before the banks open." "Consider it done," Devin assured me. "Rachel is on her way to you right now. I will join you both at the hospital shortly. Stay sharp, Paige. The fun is just beginning." I ended the call and tossed the phone onto the blanket. I picked up Bradley's divorce settlement, scanning the dense legal jargon. His lawyer had done a sloppy job, leaving massive loopholes regarding asset disclosure. Bradley believed his hidden accounts and offshore transfers were completely invisible. He believed his meticulously crafted double life was secure. He had absolutely no idea that for the past 6 months I had been digitally dissecting his entire financial existence. I dropped the papers into the trash can beside the bed. I looked down at my beautiful daughter, promising her that by the time we left this hospital, the man who had just rejected her would be entirely stripped of his power. I had made that exact same silent promise to myself precisely 6 months earlier. The sterile walls of the hospital room faded away, replaced by the memory of the sleek glass-paneled walls of my downtown Chicago accounting firm. It was a Tuesday evening in late October. The city was drenched in a freezing rain, the streetlights reflecting off the wet pavement far below my 42nd floor window. I was 3 months pregnant, nursing a lukewarm cup of decaf coffee, and working late to finalize our joint tax documents before the year-end crunch. Bradley had casually emailed me his portfolio summaries that morning, joking that he was leaving the boring paperwork to the expert. He was always so smug, so entirely convinced of his own superior intellect. That arrogance was his very first critical mistake. I had the spreadsheets open on my dual monitors. As a forensic accountant, my eyes are trained to catch deviations, the microscopic fractures in a seemingly perfect wall of numbers. Bradley was a wealth manager known for his aggressive, highly successful market strategies. He played to win, and he fiercely hated losing capital. So when my cursor hovered over a clustered series of substantial capital losses buried deep within a secondary investment account, my analytical brain snagged on the discrepancy. These were not standard market fluctuations or calculated tax loss harvesting maneuvers. They were consistent, almost rhythmic bleedouts of cash, labeled as failed micro-investments in generic tech startups. A lesser accountant would have written them off as bad bets on volatile assets. But I knew my husband. Bradley did not make blind bets without a safety net, and he certainly did not lose $50,000 in a single quarter without complaining about it endlessly over dinner. I set down my coffee mug. The quiet hum of the office ventilation system was the only sound in the empty corporate suite. I leaned closer to the glowing screens, my fingers flying across the keyboard, as I bypassed the top-level summaries and dove straight into the raw transactional metadata. I exported the raw data files and ran them through my specialized forensic tracing software, a proprietary program designed to untangle complex corporate embezzlement webs. If Bradley thought a few dummy corporations would fool me, he was severely underestimating the woman he married. The digital autopsy began. I isolated the routing numbers associated with the so-called failed investments. Within 20 minutes, the illusion started to crack wide open. The funds had not vanished into the volatile stock market. They had been deliberately transferred into a blind limited liability company registered in Delaware. From there, the money was fragmented, broken down into smaller, less conspicuous amounts, and funneled through a series of shell accounts. It was a classic, albeit incredibly clumsy and amateurish money laundering technique. He was washing our marital assets, scrubbing his fingerprints off the cash before it resurfaced elsewhere. My heart rate remained steady, though a cold dread began to pool in my stomach. The pregnant woman in me wanted to look away, to invent a rational, innocent explanation for why my husband was hiding thousands of dollars. But the forensic investigator in me ruthlessly crushed that vulnerability. I am not paid to assume innocence. I am paid to uncover the absolute truth. I followed the ghost trail of the laundered cash. The software mapped the outgoing wire transfers from the final shell account, drawing digital lines across the country and back again, finally landing on a very specific set of recurring monthly payments. The first destination was a commercial real estate management firm located just outside the affluent city limits. I pulled up the public property records and cross-referenced the payment amounts. It was a lease agreement. The monthly rent matched the exact wire transfer amount down to the cent. It was a lease for a high-end luxury apartment in a premium zip code known for its exclusivity. I pulled the tenant registration details, bypassing the management company's basic security protocols with a few simple keystrokes. The name on the lease was Brittany. No last name was needed in my mind, yet just Brittany. I sat back in my ergonomic leather chair, the glow of the monitors casting long shadows across my dark office. A luxury apartment for a woman named Brittany, subsidized entirely by the money Bradley was secretly siphoning from our joint accounts. The picture was forming ugly and sharp, but the money trail did not stop at the apartment lease. I traced the secondary wire transfers, the smaller fragments of cash that Bradley had washed through the Delaware LLC. These payments were not going to real estate firms. They were being deposited directly into local business accounts. I ran the merchant identification codes. The results flashed on my screen, each one a separate, agonizing puzzle piece. $3,000 to an upscale pediatric dental clinic, $1,500 to a boutique specializing in luxury toddler clothing, $800 a month to an elite private early childhood development center, pediatric bills, toddler clothes, childcare. My breath caught in my throat. I pressed a hand against my slightly rounded stomach, protecting the unborn daughter growing inside me. The timeline snapped into terrifying focus. Bradley and I had been married for 4 years. The financial history of this phantom child, these pediatric bills, stretched back exactly 2 years. He had not just made a recent mistake. He had not just stumbled into a brief affair. My entire marriage was a financially subsidized lie. He was maintaining a completely separate family, funding a luxury lifestyle for a mistress and a toddler, using the wealth we were supposed to be building for our own future. He came home to me every evening, kissed my cheek, and discussed our retirement portfolios, all while systematically draining our accounts to pay for pediatric dental work for another woman's son. The walls of my office felt like they were closing in. The betrayal was so vast, so deeply woven into the fabric of our daily lives, that it defied basic comprehension. He had weaponized our finances, turning my own professional domain into the tool he used to deceive me. But looking at the undeniable digital proof glowing on my screens, I did not break down. The initial shock rapidly hardened into something incredibly dangerous. Absolute calculated fury. He thought his crude financial shell games were clever. He thought he could outsmart a woman who dismantled corporate fraud syndicates for a living. Sitting alone in the dark office, I saved every single file. I captured every routing number, every merchant code, and the luxury lease agreement. I backed up the entire dataset onto an encrypted offline drive. Bradley had laid the breadcrumbs, believing himself to be an untraceable ghost. He had no idea he had just handed me the exact map I needed to burn his entire world to the ground. That map of financial deception instantly answered a deeply disturbing question that had been keeping me awake for weeks. It completely explained the bizarre sudden shift in my in-laws' behavior. Thomas and Catherine Bradley's elitist parents were old money aristocrats obsessed with legacy lineage and the preservation of their family name. During my first trimester, they had been overbearing and aggressively involved, but the very moment we hosted a small dinner to announce the results of my early genetic blood test, the atmosphere in our dining room turned instantly toxic. I had excitedly revealed we were having a girl. I expected cheers and congratulations. Instead, Catherine's forced practice smile vanished entirely, replaced by a cold, tight grimace that chilled the room. Thomas had literally pushed his untouched plate away, muttering under his breath about how a true corporate dynasty required a male heir to carry the torch. From that evening forward, they treated my pregnancy like a terminal illness. They stopped calling to check on me. They skipped the crucial ultrasound appointments they had previously demanded to attend. They barely acknowledged my growing stomach. I had initially blamed their archaic, deeply misogynistic views. I thought they were just disappointed traditionalists. But sitting in my dark office with the digital money trail glaring back at me, the true sickening reality clicked into perfect place. They were not just disappointed. They were deeply relieved. They already had their precious male heir. They had known about Brittany and little Leo the entire time. They were actively complicit in my husband's double life, allowing me to play the naive, respectable corporate wife, while they secretly doted on another woman's son. I did not confront Bradley when I went home that night. I played the exhausted pregnant wife, flawlessly listening to him complain about a difficult client while I plated our dinner. I smiled, I nodded, and I watched the man I married lie directly to my face without a single flinch of hesitation. The next morning, I called in sick to the accounting firm. Spreadsheets and wire transfers were no longer enough. I needed visual confirmation. I needed to see the ghost my husband was funding with my money. I drove 40 minutes out to the premium zip code listed on the secret apartment lease I had uncovered. It was a pristine, gated suburban oasis lined with manicured oak trees and high-end boutiques that screamed generational wealth. I parked my unassuming sedan a block away from the address and waited. Patience is the primary tool of any good auditor. 2 hours later, a sleek white Range Rover pulled out of the underground parking garage. I instantly recognized the license plate from a secondary auto insurance policy I had found in Bradley's hidden files. I followed at a safe, calculated distance, tracking the luxury vehicle to a sprawling private park reserved exclusively for local residents. I parked across the street, keeping my windows rolled up against the crisp autumn air and pulling a pair of dark sunglasses over my eyes to obscure my face. I watched with clinical detachment as a young, striking blonde woman stepped out of the driver's seat. Brittany. She moved with an arrogant sort of confidence, casually retrieving a toddler from the back car seat. But it was the man who jogged up to meet them a few moments later that made the air completely leave my lungs. Bradley. My husband. He was wearing the casual weekend sweater I had bought him for our third anniversary. He scooped the 2-year-old boy into his arms, tossing him into the air, while the child squealed with absolute delight. Brittany leaned in and kissed Bradley on the cheek, a natural, highly practiced gesture of domestic bliss. Watching my husband play the devoted, adoring father to another woman's child was a violent, suffocating gut punch. It felt like my ribs were physically caving in. The betrayal was no longer just metadata on a screen. It was flesh and bone laughing in the afternoon sun, mocking every single sacrifice I had made for our marriage. I gripped the leather steering wheel until my knuckles turned white, forcing myself to swallow the sharp bile rising in my throat. I could not break down. I had to remain entirely clinical. I was an investigator gathering irrefutable data. I sat in the stifling silence of my car for 45 minutes, watching this counterfeit family enjoy their perfect subsidized afternoon. Finally, Bradley checked his watch. It was the exact same dismissive gesture he would later use when handing me divorce papers in the hospital. He kissed Brittany, ruffled the boy's blonde hair, and jogged back toward his own car to head back to the city. Back to his corporate facade. Back to me. Brittany and the toddler lingered near a set of expensive wooden playground benches for a few more minutes. The boy began fussing, dropping a brightly colored plastic juice cup onto the manicured grass. Brittany picked it up, clearly annoyed by the sticky mess, and tossed it carelessly into a nearby municipal trash can before strapping the child back into her Range Rover. The moment her taillights disappeared around the corner, my forensic instincts fully engaged. I moved. I exited my car and walked briskly across the street, my heart pounding a steady rhythmic drumbeat against my ribs. I approached the green metal trash receptacle, scanning the area to ensure I was unobserved. The bin was mostly empty, containing only a few discarded coffee sleeves and the toddler's plastic juice cup resting right on top. I reached into my oversized leather tote bag and pulled out a sterile, sealable plastic evidence bag, a leftover habit from a corporate fraud investigation seminar I had attended years ago. Using a fresh tissue to protect the integrity of the sample, I carefully extracted the juice cup by its base, ensuring my fingers never brushed the plastic mouthpiece. I dropped the cup into the bag and sealed it tight, trapping the biological evidence inside. I walked back to my car with my ultimate weapon secured. I did not drive home to cry. I drove directly to a private, highly expedited genetics laboratory downtown. I paid their exorbitant rush fee in unrecorded cash. I needed a verified, legally binding DNA profile pulled from the saliva on that cup. I was laying the absolute groundwork for the complete and total destruction of Bradley's carefully curated universe. 2 months after securing that plastic juice cup, 4 months before my due date, I found myself sitting in the center of a very different kind of war room. Devon's corporate law firm occupied the top 3 floors of a towering downtown Chicago skyscraper. The space was a fortress of polished concrete, soundproof glass, and intimidating modern art. Devon, my sister Rachel's husband, was a brilliant, highly sought-after corporate litigator. He was a tall, sharp-featured African-American man who navigated the treacherous waters of high-stakes litigation with a terrifying, calm efficiency. I trusted him implicitly, not just because he was family, but because his mind worked exactly like mine. We were both predators in our respective fields. I sat across from his massive mahogany desk, my pregnant belly hidden beneath a structured blazer. I slid my encrypted hard drive across the polished wood surface. Devon plugged it into his secure terminal, and with a few keystrokes, the massive smartboard mounted on his wall illuminated with the digital web I had painstakingly untangled. He leaned back in his leather chair, steepling his fingers, as his dark eyes tracked the complex flow of wire transfers, shell companies, and laundered cash. I walked him through every single data point. I showed him the Delaware Limited Liability Company, the redacted rent payments for Brittany's luxury apartment, and the pediatric dental bills. Devon did not offer empty sympathy or useless apologies. He understood that I did not come to him for a shoulder to cry on. I came to him for absolute destruction. He scrutinized the numbers for a long, silent moment before letting out a low, dangerous whistle. He pointed a laser pointer at the aggregate totals flashing on the screen. The math was undeniably precise, but it revealed a massive, glaring void. Bradley was funneling nearly $20,000 a month into Brittany's lifestyle, but his documented take-home pay and our joint account withdrawals only accounted for half of that amount. "He is bleeding cash, Paige," Devon stated, his legal mind immediately detecting the anomaly. "You caught the wash cycle, but where is the initial unrecorded capital coming from? He cannot sustain this burn rate on his legitimate salary, even with his recent bonuses. He is pulling phantom money from somewhere." That question triggered the escalation we never anticipated. Devon possessed top-tier legal clearance and access to financial compliance databases that even I could not easily breach. We bypassed the personal accounts entirely and dove straight into Bradley's professional portfolio at his wealth management firm. Devin pulled public filings, cross-referenced limited partnership disclosures, and audited the routing numbers associated with Bradley's highest net worth clients. The revelation was staggering, hitting us both with the force of a freight train. Bradley was not just a cheating husband draining our personal marital assets. He was an active, systematic embezzler. The digital trail showed that he had been skimming substantial funds directly off the top of his elite clients' portfolios. He was forging authorization signatures to approve fraudulent consulting fees, routing the stolen money into offshore holding accounts, and then trickling it back into his Delaware shell company. He was literally stealing from multimillionaires to pay for Britney's designer handbags and her son's expensive childcare. My husband had morphed from a common adulterer into a white-collar criminal committing federal wire fraud on a daily basis. A cold thrill ran through my veins. The sheer magnitude of his arrogance was his ultimate vulnerability. I looked at Devin, feeling the adrenaline spike. I told him I wanted to call the Securities and Exchange Commission immediately. I wanted to draft an anonymous dossier, send it directly to the FBI, and watch federal agents drag Bradley out of his corner office in handcuffs. I was ready to detonate the bomb right then and there. Devin held up a single hand, stopping me instantly. His expression was dead serious. He warned me that exposing Bradley's federal crimes immediately would be a catastrophic tactical error for my own future. If the authorities raided Bradley's firm today, the government would immediately freeze every single asset connected to his name. Because we were legally married and filed joint tax returns, the feds would lock down my accounts too. I would be dragged into a decade of messy, agonizing litigation fighting the government just to access my own legitimate paycheck. Devin made it crystal clear that blowing the whistle now would trap me in the exact same collateral damage as my criminal husband. "We do not use a bomb when we can use a scalpel," Devin advised, his voice a low, commanding murmur. "If you turn him in right now, you lose control of the board. The government takes all his assets to pay restitution to his clients, and you walk away with absolutely nothing. We are not going to let him ruin your financial future, Paige. Instead, we are going to build a trap. We are going to let him hang himself." Devin outlined a masterstroke of legal and financial engineering. To bypass the inevitable federal asset freeze, we needed untouchable capital. Fortunately, I possessed exactly that. 2 years prior, my late aunt had left me a substantial cash inheritance. Following my own strict financial protocols, I had never commingled those funds with Bradley's money. It sat in an isolated high-yield trust that Bradley did not have any legal access to. Working late into the night, Devin and I established a brand new, highly encrypted blind LLC. We registered it under a proxy name in a secure jurisdiction, funding it entirely with my isolated inheritance. On paper, this new corporation had zero ties to Paige the wife. It was a completely independent, aggressive financial entity. Devin smiled, the glow of the monitors reflecting in his eyes. We were no longer just tracking Bradley's hidden life. We were actively weaponizing my hidden wealth. We had laid the foundation for the ultimate counterstrike, preparing to quietly buy up the illicit debts Bradley was drowning in. We were going to become his absolute worst nightmare. Bradley's arrogance blinded him to his own staggering exposure. Running a shadow Ponzi scheme with elite, highly demanding clients requires constant, uninterrupted liquidity. When the market took a sudden, volatile dip 3 months ago, his margins tightened dangerously. He needed a massive influx of untraceable cash to cover the gaping holes in his clients' portfolios before the quarterly automated reports were generated and mailed out. He could not walk into a traditional bank. A standard regulated underwriter would demand my signature as his legal spouse and mandate a deep forensic dive into our joint financials. So he ventured into the murky, unregulated waters of shadow banking. He sought out a private predatory lending syndicate willing to overlook marital consent laws in exchange for an exorbitant, crippling interest rate. To secure the phantom cash, he collateralized the one clean, massive asset he mistakenly thought he completely controlled: our sprawling, fully paid-off suburban estate. He forged my signature on the secondary mortgage documents. It was an act of sheer, breathtaking desperation that firmly sealed his fate. He secured a massive high-interest cash loan against the very roof over my head, betting our home to cover his federal crimes. He believed he had successfully patched the leaking hull of his embezzlement scheme. He thought he was a genius. He had absolutely no idea that Devin and I were tracking his every single frantic move in real time. Through our newly established, highly encrypted blind corporate entity, Devin approached the shadow lender. Predatory lenders care only about immediate guaranteed profit and swift risk mitigation. Devon, operating under the guise of our anonymous LLC, made them an offer they could not refuse. We purchased Bradley's toxic debt at a premium, utilizing the isolated inheritance I had kept hidden. The transaction was seamless, entirely legal, and utterly invisible to my husband. The deed to the massive debt transferred directly to the LLC. In the span of a single afternoon, I effectively became the anonymous, unforgiving creditor holding the paper on my own home. Every month, Bradley wired a crippling mortgage payment to a faceless corporate entity, completely oblivious to the bitter irony that he was depositing money directly into my private war chest. We owned him. We held the invisible leash, simply waiting for the precise, devastating moment to pull it tight. The sterile chemical scent of hospital antiseptic pulled me sharply back to the present reality of the maternity ward. The digital ghosts of 4 months ago vanished, replaced by the rhythmic, steady breathing of my newborn daughter, resting in the clear plastic bassinet beside my bed. The hospital room was cloaked in the heavy, quiet darkness of early morning. The crumpled, insulting divorce settlement Bradley had tossed onto my rolling tray table remained in the trash can, a pathetic testament to his shattered delusions of control. He had given me until sunrise to sign away my life. He had promised to move Brittany and her toddler son into my master bedroom by tomorrow afternoon. He believed I was a trapped, helpless victim. It was time to show him exactly who held the deed to his reality. I reached for the sleek silver laptop hidden securely beneath my overnight bag. I flipped the screen open, the sudden sharp blue light cutting through the dim hospital shadows. My fingers moved with the practiced lethal precision of a forensic accountant executing a final fatal audit. I routed my internet connection through the encrypted virtual private network Devin had established, masking my location and completely burying my digital footprint. I logged into the secure administrative portal of our blind LLC. The corporate dashboard loaded, instantly displaying Bradley's massive outstanding loan balance in glowing red numerals. I navigated through the complex architecture of the site to the default trigger protocols. Bradley's loan agreement, drafted by ruthless shadow bankers, was laced with aggressive zero-tolerance clauses that he had foolishly signed in his blind desperation for cash. One specific ironclad covenant allowed the holding creditor to demand the immediate full repayment of the principal balance if any fraudulent activity was detected in the original loan application. He had forged my signature. The fraud was undeniably documented, verified, and legally actionable. I did not need to wait for him to miss a monthly payment. I had the absolute unilateral power to detonate the debt right now. I hovered the cursor over the execution command. I looked at Emma, watching her tiny chest rise and fall. I silently promised her that the man who had so coldly abandoned us would never sleep another night under our roof. I pressed the enter key. The system processed the command with a satisfying, instantaneous confirmation prompt. The default notice was officially legally triggered. Automated legal mandates were instantly generated and dispatched directly to the county sheriff's office and the local property eviction authorities. Within hours, long before Brittany could even finish packing her cardboard moving boxes across town, a team of court-appointed officers would arrive at the suburban estate. They would bypass Bradley's expensive security system, change the locks on every door, secure the perimeter, and post a massive, brightly colored notice of immediate foreclosure and property seizure on the front door. Bradley's sanctuary. The luxurious, sprawling love nest he had so arrogantly promised his mistress was legally gone. He had ordered me to clear out my personal belongings by the end of the week, entirely unaware that he no longer had the right to step foot on the driveway. I closed the laptop, the screen going black, leaving me in the quiet shadows of the maternity ward. A cold, sharp smile touched my lips. The financial slaughter had officially begun, and Bradley was about to wake up to a world where he had been systematically stripped of everything he possessed. The digital clock on the wall shifted to exactly 3 in the morning when the heavy wooden door to my hospital room swung open. There was no gentle knock, no hesitant peeking around the corner to see if the new mother was resting. Rachel and Devin walked in with the synchronized, focused precision of an extraction team. There were absolutely no tearful hugs, no sympathetic hand squeezes, and no high-pitched cooing over my newborn daughter. The time for conventional family comfort had completely evaporated the moment Bradley dropped that pre-drafted divorce settlement onto my tray table. This was a military command center now, and we were operating strictly on wartime protocols. Rachel immediately locked the heavy door behind them, pulling the privacy blinds completely shut across the interior glass window to block out the glowing corridor. She set a heavy canvas tote bag on the linoleum floor, swiftly unpacking 2 thermal thermoses of pitch-black coffee, a stack of blank legal pads, and an array of charging cables. She handed me a steaming cup without a word, her eyes locking onto mine with a fierce, silent solidarity. Devin did not even bother taking off his tailored wool trench coat. He dragged the single uncomfortable vinyl visitor chair directly to the side of my hospital bed, unzipped his sleek leather briefcase, and pulled out his primary workstation laptop. Within 60 seconds, the sterile, quiet maternity suite was transformed into a high-security legal bunker. As Devin booted up his encrypted operating system, my cell phone resting near the edge of the mattress began to vibrate. It buzzed once, then twice, then erupted into a continuous aggressive tremor against the crisp white sheets. I picked it up, the harsh glare of the screen illuminating the dim space. It was Bradley. He was wide awake, and he was actively reveling in his perceived dominance. He was firing off a rapid succession of text messages, each one laced with a heavier dose of venom and arrogance than the last. He demanded to know if I had signed his garbage settlement yet. He reminded me that the sun would be up in less than 3 hours, explicitly stating that at the exact stroke of dawn he would log into his corporate employee portal and immediately terminate my premium medical coverage. He wanted me to panic. He wanted me to lie awake in the dark, imagining the crushing, suffocating weight of a 6-figure hospital bill landing squarely on my shoulders while I held an infant who was less than 24 hours old. I read the texts aloud, my voice devoid of any tremor or inflection. Bradley boasted that Brittany was currently sealing the last of her moving boxes in her apartment across town. He bragged that the moving truck was already fully loaded, explicitly taunting me with the detail that his mistress was packing her designer clothes to hang in my master closet. He painted a vivid, sickening picture of a seamless transition, replacing me with a new family without missing a single beat. He thought his psychological warfare was breaking me down. He believed he was the apex predator cornering a weak, financially dependent woman who would desperately surrender all her assets just to keep a roof over her head and health insurance for his unwanted daughter. I handed the phone to Devin. He glanced at the glowing screen, scanning the barrage of threats, his expression entirely unreadable. He did not look angry or surprised. He looked like a seasoned hunter who had just spotted an opponent stepping willingly into a snare. He set my phone face down on the rolling tray table and turned his attention fully to his laptop. Bradley assumed his threats were absolute because he possessed the login credentials to his own employee benefits portal. He actually believed that clicking a button on his end would immediately sever my lifeline. Devin was about to demonstrate the staggering, terrifying difference between a mid-level wealth manager and a heavyweight corporate litigator. Devin did not bother trying to hack into Bradley's personal account or set up temporary digital roadblocks. He went straight for the jugular. He bypassed Bradley entirely. Opening a secure communication channel, Devin drafted a high-priority, legally binding directive. It was 3:30 in the morning, but men operating at Devin's echelon of power did not wait for normal business hours. He directed his communications straight to the senior managing partners and the chief legal counsel of Bradley's wealth management firm. Devin wielded the full devastating weight of his own prestigious law firm's reputation. He attached a preemptive, ironclad injunction that he had already drafted and pushed through a federal judge he kept on emergency retainer. The legal document explicitly prohibited any modification, termination, or alteration of my healthcare policy by anyone other than a court-appointed arbiter. Devon cited immediate medical endangerment, federal ERISA law violations, and malicious spousal abandonment during a critical life-threatening hospitalization. The directive carried a thinly veiled, razor-sharp threat of massive corporate liability and negative media exposure if the firm allowed their employee to execute his malicious plan using their corporate infrastructure. Devon hit the send key. We sat in total silence listening to the soft hum of the hospital ventilation system and Emma's quiet, rhythmic breathing. 17 minutes later, Devon's screen flashed with a high-priority incoming message. He clicked it open, his dark eyes rapidly scanning the text. A sharp, incredibly satisfied smile broke across his face. The senior partners at Bradley's firm had received the injunction and reacted with absolute panic. Recognizing the immense legal and public relations peril Devon had just dropped into their laps, they had completely locked Bradley out of his own human resources portal. His administrative privileges were entirely frozen. The firm's chief legal counsel personally replied, guaranteeing that my premium health insurance policy was locked down, fully funded, and totally untouchable. Bradley's primary weapon, the threat of immediate medical bankruptcy, was entirely neutralized. He had no idea his ammunition had just been stripped away. He was still sitting in the dark, eagerly waiting for the sun to rise, completely unaware that his own superiors had just chained his hands behind his back. The red digital digits on the wall clock clicked silently forward, marching steadily toward 5 in the morning. Devon closed his laptop lid a fraction, the sharp blue glow receding from his face as he took a long, calculated sip of his black coffee. Our defensive perimeter was now completely secured, leaving me free to finally launch the offensive strike. I pulled my silver laptop back onto the rolling tray, the screen reflecting in the sterile hospital lighting. Bradley's crude embezzlement scheme required a specialized, unforgiving kind of exposure. Handing this level of corporate theft solely back to his wealth management firm would result in a quiet internal investigation, a hushed termination, and a sealed non-disclosure agreement to protect their elite institutional reputation. They would sweep his fraud under a very expensive rug to avoid bad press. I refused to let him fade quietly into the shadows. I wanted his absolute ruin broadcast on federal channels. I opened the encrypted partition on my hard drive, accessing the raw data I had painstakingly extracted over the past 4 months. It was time to package the poison. I began compiling a comprehensive, heavily encrypted dossier. This was not a simple summary of grievances from a scorned wife. It was a flawless, airtight prosecution package handed over on a digital silver platter. I attached the complete, untampered ledgers, detailing every single unauthorized withdrawal he had made from his high-net-worth clients. I included the forensic tracing maps that visually linked those stolen funds directly to his offshore routing numbers. I added the high-resolution scans of the forged authorization signatures he had used to bypass internal compliance checks. Every fraudulent consulting fee, every dummy invoice, and every wash transaction funneling into the Delaware shell company was categorized, cross-referenced, and undeniably proven. Rachel stood quietly by the window, keeping a watchful eye on the dark parking lot below, while Devon leaned over my shoulder, verifying the statutory references. We were not sending this to his immediate supervisors or human resources. We were bypassing the corporate ladder entirely. I opened a new secure email client and entered the direct intake addresses for the Securities and Exchange Commission's whistleblower division. In the carbon copy line, I added the specific regional submission portal for the Federal Bureau of Investigation's white-collar crime unit. The magnitude of his theft breached federal banking regulations across multiple state lines. This was no longer a domestic dispute over hidden assets. It was a massive documented felony that carried decades of mandatory prison time. I drafted a brief, highly technical cover letter outlining the exact nature of the enclosed attachments. I provided the decryption keys and a verified timeline of the embezzlement spanning the entire duration of his double life. I did not include my name or any personal identifying information. The data itself was robust enough to mandate an immediate aggressive federal inquiry. But I did not hit the send button. Doing so now would alert the authorities before Bradley had the chance to walk completely into my trap. I needed him to be utterly, hopelessly confident right up until the floor gave way beneath him. Using the email client scheduling tool, I programmed a delayed send. I calibrated the timer with meticulous precision, scheduling the encrypted dossier to blast out to every federal agency on that list at exactly 8 o'clock this morning. By the time the financial markets opened and the federal agents started downloading the files, Bradley would be standing right in front of me, trapped in his own hubris. I leaned back against the stiff hospital pillows, letting out a slow, controlled breath. The trap was set. The timer was ticking. Just as I closed the laptop, my cell phone vibrated violently against the plastic tray. It was another text from Bradley. He had been silent for the last hour, likely pacing his pristine apartment and anticipating his glorious morning victory. I unlocked the screen and read the incoming message. The sheer, breathtaking arrogance of his words almost made me laugh. He was not satisfied with just threatening my health care or demanding my signature on his pathetic settlement. He wanted a theatrical, humiliating surrender. The text was a masterpiece of malicious intent. Bradley gloated that his parents, Thomas and Catherine, were currently in transit. He proudly announced that Brittany was riding in the passenger seat beside him. They were all coming to the hospital together. They were arriving as a united, victorious front to demand my signature on those miserable divorce papers, permanently replace me with his mistress, and finally wash their hands of the woman who had failed to provide them with a male heir. He explicitly stated they would be walking through my door in less than 30 minutes, fully expecting me to be a broken, sobbing mess, ready to capitulate to their every demand. I read the text twice, letting the reality of his monumental stupidity wash over me. He was deliberately bringing his accomplices straight into the blast radius. Thomas and Catherine, who cared only about their pristine social standing and aristocratic legacy, were walking directly into a federal fraud implosion that would permanently shatter their family name. Brittany, who thought she had secured a wealthy corporate husband and a sprawling suburban mansion, was arriving just in time to watch her sugar daddy lose his freedom and his fortune simultaneously. I locked the phone and set it down next to the sleeping newborn. My heart rate was perfectly steady. The exhaustion of labor and the sting of his betrayal were entirely overridden by cold, tactical clarity. I looked up at Devin, who was quietly packing away his charging cables, and then at my sister Rachel, who had turned away from the window. I met their gaze, my voice calm and absolute in the quiet hospital room. The targets are inbound. The digital clock on the sterile hospital wall shifted the red numbers, marching steadily toward 6:30 in the morning. The quiet, agonizing anticipation that had filled the room since Devin locked down Bradley's corporate portal shattered instantly when the heavy wooden door burst open. There was no polite knock, no gentle inquiry from a passing nurse. The door hit the rubber wall, stopped with a violent echoing thud. Bradley marched into the maternity ward, leading the charge with the inflated, repulsive swagger of a conquering general. He was dressed in a crisp, freshly pressed suit, his face set in a mask of supreme, unearned confidence. Flanking him were his parents, Thomas and Catherine. They stepped into the dimly lit room, carrying an air of aristocratic disgust. Their eyes scanned the modest, functional medical space as if they were actively searching for a foul odor, their posture rigid with inherent superiority. Trailing just a few steps behind them was Brittany. She wore a bright, ostentatious designer dress that was entirely inappropriate for a hospital visit at dawn, her face painted with flawless camera-ready makeup. Perched securely on her hip was her toddler son Leo. Brittany bounced him slightly, parading the boy around the confined space of the maternity ward like a newly crowned prince. She flashed a sickeningly sweet, triumphant smile at everyone in her line of sight, ensuring she played the role of the victorious new matriarch to absolute perfection. She looked at the standard hospital furniture and the rolling tray tables, with visible disdain, whispering loudly to the toddler that his daddy was going to take them to their massive, beautiful new estate later today. I remained perfectly still against the stiff hospital pillows. I did not pull the thin blankets up to shield myself. I did not shrink away from their combined hostile glare. Rachel stood completely rigid at the foot of my bed, her arms crossed tight over her chest, her expression a mask of pure protective stone. Devon remained seated in the far corner of the room, swallowed entirely by the deep shadows cast by the drawn privacy blinds. He was perfectly still, completely unobserved by the invading party. Bradley approached the side of the bed, pointing a sharp finger at the unsigned divorce papers still resting in the plastic trash bin. He sneered, opening his mouth to launch into his rehearsed threatening monologue, but his mother swiftly cut him off. Catherine glided forward, the heavy, expensive scent of her designer perfume, fighting a losing battle against the sharp tang of hospital antiseptic. She did not bother to offer a greeting, nor did she ask how I was recovering from childbirth. Instead, she leaned directly over the clear plastic bassinet where Emma was sleeping. Catherine stared down at my newborn daughter, her perfectly manicured lip curling upward in an expression of profound, unfiltered disappointment. She stood up straight, smoothing the front of her tailored jacket, and fixed her cold, piercing gaze directly on me. She stated, her voice sharp and dripping with absolute condescension, that my inability to produce a male heir was a pathetic biological failure. She proclaimed that the family bloodline required strength, legacy, and continuity, all things that only a son could provide. In her deeply twisted worldview, my daughter was nothing more than an irrelevant, costly mistake, and I was simply a defective vessel that had finally outlived its usefulness. Thomas stood firmly behind his wife, nodding in solemn, grim agreement, entirely endorsing the verbal slaughter of his own newborn granddaughter. Brittany shifted Leo to her other hip, beaming with unchecked pride. She cooed at the toddler, running a hand through his hair, reveling in her status as the mother of the prized male child. The sheer intoxicating delusion radiating from the group was staggering. They had confidently marched straight into a rigged minefield, completely convinced they were strolling through a manicured garden. Catherine reached into her pristine, oversized leather handbag. Her hand emerged holding a thick, heavy manila envelope which she casually tossed onto the center of my bed. It landed with a dense, heavy thud against my legs. She proudly announced that the envelope contained exactly $20,000 in untraceable bundled cash. She framed the insulting pile of money not as a legal settlement, but as an incredibly generous severance package. Catherine dictated her terms with the absolute unquestionable authority of a dictator. She ordered me to take the cash sign, Bradley's divorce papers, immediately and quietly disappear from their lives forever. She demanded I pack my personal belongings and vacate the suburban estate by noon, so that the true family could assume their rightful place in the home without any messy, drawn-out legal friction. Bradley nodded vigorously, crossing his arms and demanding I stop being difficult, take the ultimate payout, and accept their charity. They stood around the bed and waited for the inevitable breakdown. They fully expected me to scream, to hurl the envelope back at their faces, or to dissolve into a puddle of hysterical, defeated postpartum tears. They anticipated begging, bargaining, and desperate capitulation. I looked down at the thick envelope resting on the white blanket. I did not touch it. I slowly lifted my gaze, meeting Catherine's icy stare with a look of absolute terrifying calm. I did not yell. I did not shed a single tear. I did not bother trying to defend my daughter or myself to people who were mere hours away from losing everything they held dear. Instead, I offered them a slow, razor-sharp smile. I raised my right hand, extending a single finger, and gestured deliberately toward the dark, quiet corner of the room. The shadows immediately shifted. The soft, rhythmic click of expensive leather shoes on the hard linoleum floor echoed through the sudden, tense silence. Devon stepped smoothly into the fluorescent light. He looked immaculate in his tailored suit and wool trench coat, his towering presence instantly commanding all the oxygen in the room. In his right hand, he held a thick, meticulously bound stack of highly sensitive legal documents. It was not a simple counteroffer or a standard family court filing. It was a completely comprehensive dossier of total financial ruin, detailing the exact corporate structures that now owned their precious suburban estate, alongside the injunctions that had already paralyzed Bradley's professional standing. The smug, victorious expressions on the faces of Thomas, Catherine Bradley, and Brittany vanished in an instant, replaced by a sudden jarring wave of profound confusion and rising panic. Bradley blinked, the smug certainty faltering on his face, for only a fraction of a second before his inherent narcissism overrode his surprise. He recognized Devon, of course, but his rigid, compartmentalized ego categorized my brother-in-law merely as an overprotective relative playing the role of a bedside bodyguard. Bradley refused to acknowledge the lethal, calculated aura Devon projected. Instead, my husband straightened his tie, puffed out his chest, and pointed a demanding finger directly at my face. He ordered me to stop playing childish games. He insisted that bringing a corporate lawyer to a family dispute was a pathetic, desperate intimidation tactic that would not work. He jabbed his finger toward the thick envelope of cash resting on the white hospital blanket, his voice rising in an impatient, commanding bark. He told me to take the generous payout his mother had so graciously provided, sign the divorce settlement he had drafted, and let them all move on with their lives. He warned me that his patience was completely exhausted and that this was the absolute final offer before he left me with nothing. Devon did not blink. He did not raise his voice, nor did he display a single ounce of the emotional volatility that fueled my in-laws. He simply took one deliberate step forward, inserting his towering frame directly between Bradley and my hospital bed, effectively cutting off my husband's line of sight to me and my newborn daughter. The movement was smooth, utterly dominant, and carried the undeniable gravity of a man who destroyed multi-million-dollar corporations before lunch. Devon held out the thick, meticulously bound stack of legal documents, pressing them directly against Bradley's chest. Instinctively, Bradley took the papers, his brow furrowing in irritation. He let out a condescending scoff, sneering at Devon. He arrogantly stated that he was not interested in reading a pathetic counteroffer or entertaining a desperate plea for alimony. He boasted that his own legal team would crush whatever amateur hour demands we had managed to cobble together in the middle of the night. Devon's voice dropped to a low, resonant timbre that commanded absolute terrified silence. He informed Bradley that the document he was holding was not a counteroffer, a settlement, or a negotiation. It was an emergency ex parte, court-ordered asset freeze. The air in the maternity ward suddenly felt razor-thin. Catherine's indignant sputtering died in her throat, and Thomas took a slow, uncertain step backward. Brittany shifted her weight, pulling the toddler closer to her chest, her previously triumphant smile melting into a mask of sudden, creeping apprehension. Devon explained the brutal, inescapable legal reality of Bradley's situation with surgical precision. He detailed how I had formally filed for divorce under the grounds of extreme marital asset dissipation. He outlined chapter and verse how the family court took a deeply hostile view of a spouse who systematically drained shared commingled marital funds to secretly finance a lavish hidden lifestyle for a mistress. Devon informed my husband that a superior court judge had reviewed a preliminary audit of our joint accounts, seen the staggering, unauthorized hemorrhaging of cash, and immediately granted a blanket freeze to prevent any further financial bleed. Bradley's face flushed a deep, mottled red. He tried to interrupt loudly, insisting that he was the primary breadwinner, that he managed the wealth, and that a judge could not simply cut him off from his own hard-earned money. Devon remained entirely unbothered by the outburst. He continued his explanation, his tone as cold and hard as concrete. He clarified that the injunction officially and unconditionally revoked Bradley's access to every single joint checking account, every shared savings reserve, and every commingled investment portfolio attached to his name. Furthermore, Devon stated the court order extended directly to the massive revolving credit lines Bradley utilized to maintain his daily illusion of extreme wealth. The financial chokehold was absolute, encompassing every single liquid asset that had not already been siphoned off. Thomas stepped forward, his aristocratic veneer cracking. He blustered, threatening to call their own high-powered family attorneys, claiming this ambush was highly illegal and a gross violation of due process. Catherine clutched her designer handbag, her eyes darting frantically between her son and the towering lawyer blocking their path. Devon did not even dignify their panicked protests with a response. He kept his dark, unwavering gaze locked entirely on Bradley, watching the man's arrogant facade begin to fracture under the crushing weight of the legal reality. Bradley let out a sharp, derisive laugh, shaking his head in aggressive denial. He flatly refused to believe that he had been outmaneuvered. He insisted that Devon was bluffing, trying to leverage fake documents to scare him into a more favorable divorce payout. With a defiant, mocking glare, Bradley reached into the interior pocket of his tailored suit jacket and pulled out his smartphone. He announced that he was going to log into his elite banking application right now, transfer $10,000 into Brittany's personal checking account, just to prove a point, and then walk out the door. Devon gestured toward the phone with a slow, inviting sweep of his hand. He softly encouraged Bradley to log in. The room fell into a deathly, suffocating silence as Bradley held the phone up, his thumb swiping across the screen. We all watched his face. The smug, invincible smirk was still plastered across his features as the facial recognition software unlocked the device. He tapped the icon for his primary financial institution. The blue loading circle spun for a fraction of a second before the home dashboard materialized on the bright screen. I watched from the bed as the blood completely drained from my husband's face, leaving him a sickening ashen gray. The muscles in his jaw went slack. His eyes widened in absolute, unadulterated horror as they tracked across the digital display. Where there should have been healthy, robust six-figure balances, there were only glaring red zeros. His primary checking account read 0. The shared savings reserve read 0. He frantically tapped the screen, navigating to the premium high-limit credit accounts he relied on to fund Brittany's luxury apartments and designer shopping sprees. The available credit on every single card displayed a negative balance flagged with bold, unmistakable suspension notices. His breathing grew shallow and erratic. He swiped wildly, closing the app and reopening it, utterly convinced it was a glitch, a server error, a temporary digital mistake. But the reality remained stubbornly, horrifyingly unchanged. The screen stared back at him, an illuminated testament to his total financial paralysis. Devon adjusted his cuffs, his voice breaking the tense, terrified silence. He calmly informed Bradley that the heavy, prestigious platinum cards currently sitting in his designer leather wallet were officially nothing more than dead plastic. He was completely, irrevocably cut off, standing in the middle of a hospital room with a mistress to support a wealthy family, expecting a victory, and absolutely zero access to a single cent of his own money. Bradley stared at the blank screen of his smartphone, his chest heaving as the absolute reality of Devon's words bounced off the impenetrable, reinforced armor of his ego. He shoved the device violently back into the interior pocket of his tailored jacket, flatly refusing to let the rising tide of panic show on his face. He let out a loud, theatrical scoff, adjusting his cufflinks with jerky, highly agitated movements. He loudly declared to the room that he did not need a single cent of my miserable, restricted marital assets. He boasted, his voice echoing sharply off the sterile walls, that his personal corporate wealth and elite institutional connections were vastly superior to whatever temporary amateur roadblocks a jealous ex-wife had managed to file. Snatching the thick manila envelope of cash off my bed, he turned to his bewildered entourage, gesturing aggressively for them to follow. He ordered his parents and Brittany out of the maternity ward, boldly proclaiming that they were leaving this depressing environment and heading straight back to his sanctuary. He promised them all a lavish celebratory brunch at the suburban estate, completely convinced his sprawling castle was waiting for him with open arms. They marched out in a frantic, uncoordinated huddle, the heavy hospital door swinging shut behind them and instantly sealing off their chaotic, toxic energy. 10 minutes later, the grand illusion of Bradley's untouchable status met the unforgiving mechanical reality of an automated payment machine. The hospital's subterranean VIP parking garage was a dimly lit cavern of thick concrete and lingering exhaust fumes. Bradley sat behind the wheel of his pristine leased sports coupe, the engine purring with a low aggressive hum. Brittany sat in the passenger seat, adjusting her oversized designer sunglasses and bouncing a fussy Leo on her lap, while Thomas and Catherine idled in their heavy luxury sedan directly behind his bumper. Bradley pulled up to the exit gate, the bright digital display flashing an exorbitant overnight parking fee. He rolled down his window with a confident flick of his wrist, flashing a reassuring, arrogant smile at Brittany before pulling a sleek, heavy metal platinum card from his leather wallet. He inserted it into the reader without even looking at the screen, already bragging about the private chef he planned to hire for the afternoon. A sharp, obnoxious electronic beep shattered his monologue. The digital screen flashed a bright red error message indicating the transaction was declined. Bradley frowned, snatching the metal card back. He muttered a quick, dismissive excuse to Brittany about fraud protection algorithms triggering on unfamiliar hospital terminals. He pulled out a second card, a high-limit corporate expense account, and shoved it aggressively into the slot. Another sharp beep echoed in the damp concrete space. Declined. The color began to drain from his face once more. He furiously dug through his wallet, pulling out a third, then a fourth card, angrily swiping each piece of plastic through the unyielding machine. The automated gate remained firmly lowered, a yellow and black striped barrier, mocking his rapidly escalating desperation. Behind him, Thomas lightly tapped his car horn, signaling his impatience. Behind Thomas, a line of 3 other vehicles had already formed, their drivers entirely uninterested in the financial implosion of the man blocking the only exit. Another driver laid on their horn a long, aggressive blare that bounced deafeningly off the low concrete ceilings. Bradley swore loudly, slamming his fist against the leather steering wheel. He leaned half his body out the window, frantically jamming his phone against the contactless payment sensor, only to be met with the exact same cheerful, automated rejection tone. The lineup of cars multiplied, the glaring headlights illuminating his failure. Angry shouts echoed from the back of the queue, demanding he move his vehicle out of the way. The humiliation was absolute and entirely inescapable. The wealthy, untouchable corporate executive was trapped in a damp, subterranean parking garage, utterly unable to scrape together $45 to lift a cheap wooden arm. The passenger door of the sedan behind him swung open. Thomas marched up to the driver's side of Bradley's car, his face a tight mask of profound aristocratic embarrassment. Without uttering a single word to his son, the older man reached over Bradley's shoulder, tapped his own black card against the sensor, and stepped back in disgust. The machine chimed a pleasant approval, and the gate smoothly lifted. Bradley gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles turning stark white, his pride shredded in front of an audience of impatient strangers, his parents and his mistress. But his narcissism remained a powerful, blinding shield. As he accelerated out of the garage and into the morning light, he looked over at Brittany, his voice tight but dripping with venomous arrogance. He swore to her that this was merely a minor administrative inconvenience, a pathetic final tantrum from a bitter woman. He promised that the second they arrived at the sprawling suburban estate, he was calling an emergency locksmith to permanently secure the perimeter, ensuring I would be locked out of my own home forever. Back in the serene quiet of the maternity ward, the air felt incredibly light and breathable. The suffocating toxicity of the morning had been entirely purged from the room. Rachel efficiently packed my small overnight bag, humming a quiet, cheerful tune while carefully folding the few items of clothing I had brought. I signed my official discharge papers with a remarkably steady hand, smiling and thanking the attending nurse who had silently witnessed the dawn's chaotic invasion. I carefully lifted Emma from the clear plastic bassinet, wrapping her securely in a soft, warm receiving blanket. The lingering physical exhaustion of labor was completely overshadowed by the electric thrill of a flawlessly executed strategy. Devin stepped out into the brightly lit hallway, leading the way with my bag slung effortlessly over his shoulder, his demeanor calm, professional, and highly vigilant. We navigated the quiet hospital corridors and descended to the main lobby, where the crisp morning air rushed in through the sliding glass doors. A sleek black SUV was idling perfectly at the curb, its tinted windows offering absolute privacy and security. Devin opened the heavy rear door, extending a hand to help me settle into the plush leather seats, while Rachel ensured Emma was safely secured in her car seat. As the door shut, isolating us in the quiet, climate-controlled cabin, I leaned back and closed my eyes. The immediate battlefield had been cleared, and I was moving precisely onto the next stage of his absolute ruin. The black SUV merged smoothly onto the interstate, leaving the hospital far behind us. I settled into the plush leather, Emma sleeping peacefully in her carrier beside me. Devin sat in the front passenger seat, his face illuminated by the soft glow of his tablet. He reached back without a word, handing me a sleek silver screen. The display was divided into a grid of high-definition video feeds, streaming live from the discreet security cameras blanketing my suburban estate. The trap was about to spring its final physical jaw, and I had a front-row seat to the execution. On the top left quadrant of the screen, Bradley's leased sports coupe aggressively swerved into the expansive circular driveway of the property. Thomas and Catherine's heavy luxury sedan parked directly behind him, boxing him in. The passenger door flew open before the car even shifted into park. Brittany stepped out, practically vibrating with uncontainable excitement. She twirled on the pristine cobblestones, pointing out the immaculate landscaping, the towering brick facade, and the sprawling manicured lawns to her toddler. She was completely intoxicated by the illusion, ready to waltz through the grand double doors and officially claim her stolen kingdom. She adjusted her designer dress, adopting the haughty, entitled posture of the new lady of the house. Bradley marched up the wide limestone steps with a heavy, purposeful stride, clearly eager to wash away the stinging, pathetic humiliation of the parking garage. He approached the brass smart lock on the front door, jabbing his finger against the digital keypad with aggressive entitlement. He punched in his personalized access code, expecting the familiar welcoming chime. Instead, a sharp, solid red light flashed across the digital display. The tablet's audio feed picked up the harsh, rejecting beep. Access denied. Bradley scoffed, his shoulders tensing as he assumed it was a simple technological glitch. He wiped his finger on his trousers and aggressively keyed the numbers in a second time, pressing harder on the glass screen. Another bright red flash illuminated his frustrated face. Visibly losing his temper, he yanked his keychain from his pocket. He sifted through the metal rings, isolating the heavy brass master key, and shoved it toward the cylinder. It refused to enter. He twisted and forced it, scratching the metal plate, utterly baffled by the resistance. The entire locking mechanism had been entirely replaced overnight with a state-of-the-art high-security system. He began to pound his fist against the heavy oak door, shouting my name, completely convinced I had somehow rushed home to barricade myself inside. He did not get the chance to strike the wood a third time. The grand double doors suddenly swung open, but not by my hand. Two massive, broad-shouldered private security contractors stepped out onto the porch. They were dressed in immaculate black tactical uniforms, their utility belts outfitted with heavy professional equipment. They crossed their arms, completely blocking the threshold, towering over my husband. The lead guard, a man with a stern, unforgiving face, stared down at Bradley. He did not ask how he could help. He did not offer a polite morning greeting. He flatly, coldly informed Bradley that he was actively trespassing on a secured, privately owned corporate property and that he needed to vacate the premises immediately. Through the tablet's crisp audio feed, I listened to Bradley completely erupt. He screamed that he was the owner of the estate, that his name was on the deed, and that these men were making a monumental career-ending mistake. He demanded they step aside aggressively, waving his arms and pointing to Brittany, loudly claiming he was bringing his family into his own home. The security guard did not flinch. He remained perfectly still, a solid wall of absolute authority. He calmly pulled a laminated injunction from his vest pocket and held it up, stating clearly that the holding company controlling the estate had officially revoked Bradley's residency privileges. He was no longer a homeowner. He was a hostile intruder. Thomas and Catherine rushed up the steps, their aristocratic outrage flaring, as they demanded to speak to a manager, utterly failing to comprehend that their social standing held absolutely zero currency here. Just as Bradley wound up to launch another barrage of empty legal threats, a loud, rhythmic beeping sliced through the crisp morning air. A massive commercial moving truck slowly reversed up the long driveway, its heavy tires crunching over the cobblestones. It bypassed the parked luxury cars and came to a hissing halt near the edge of the manicured front lawn. Bradley stopped yelling, his brow furrowing in deep confusion as the heavy rear door of the truck rolled upward. A crew of 4 men in matching work shirts jumped out of the cab. They did not approach the house or ask for directions. Instead, they began hauling out dozens of heavy sealed cardboard boxes from the belly of the truck. They marched straight to the property line, right where the pristine grass met the public sidewalk, and began dropping the boxes onto the concrete. It was not a careful, organized delivery. It was a brutal public eviction. Bradley stepped off the porch, his eyes widening in horror as a mover unceremoniously tossed a familiar scuffed leather golf bag onto the growing pile. It was a meticulously curated collection of absolute garbage. Devin and I had not thrown out the expensive watches, the tailored suits, or the high-end electronics purchased with commingled marital funds. Those high-value assets were currently locked down in the forensic audit, completely untouchable. What the movers were dumping on the curb was everything Bradley had brought into our marriage before he started stealing my money. They tossed out his cheap, faded college gym clothes, his obsolete gaming consoles from a decade ago, and a collection of embarrassing, framed frat house posters. They dropped a plastic bin filled with his scuffed sneakers and a box of cheap promotional corporate mugs he had hoarded over the years. Brittany stood frozen on the driveway, clutching her toddler, her mouth hanging completely open. The magnificent, wealthy provider she thought she had trapped was currently being reduced to a man whose entire worldly possessions consisted of a curb full of cheap frat boy relics. Thomas and Catherine stared in absolute paralyzing shock as their son's pathetic reality was broadcast right on the edge of the public street for every wealthy neighbor to witness. From the quiet sanctuary of the SUV, I watched Bradley fall to his knees next to a box of tangled, outdated charging cables, the absolute crushing finality of his ruin finally sinking in. Bradley's brief moment of despair on the curb vanished as quickly as it had arrived, instantly swallowed by a surging, blinding tide of narcissistic rage. He scrambled up from the pavement, violently kicking the cardboard box of outdated electronics and sending a tangled web of obsolete charging cords skittering across the asphalt. He spun wildly toward the stoic security contractors, blocking the grand double doors, and the indifferent moving crew, dumping his pathetic relics onto the grass. His voice cracked as he screamed threats of immediate police intervention, multi-million-dollar lawsuits, and severe federal charges. He furiously yanked his smartphone from his jacket pocket, his thumb stabbing aggressively at the glass screen to dial the authorities, entirely forgetting that his cellular service plan was permanently anchored to the corporate accounts Devin had completely annihilated an hour prior. Before the reality of his dead, useless phone could fully register, the heavy tires of our black SUV crunched loudly onto the pristine cobblestones of the circular driveway. Bradley froze mid-shout, his thumb hovering uselessly over the dark screen as our vehicle glided to a smooth, calculated halt. The SUV parked perfectly between his miserable pile of garbage and the wide limestone steps of the estate. Devin killed the engine and stepped out into the crisp morning air, moving with the fluid, practiced efficiency of a man who left nothing to chance. He walked around the rear of the vehicle, popped the trunk, and retrieved a sleek, lightweight medical wheelchair, unfolding it onto the pavement with a sharp, echoing snap. Rachel remained securely in the back seat, holding Emma against her chest, her eyes locked fiercely on the unfolding spectacle. Devin opened my passenger door and offered his arm. Every single muscle in my lower body ached with the fresh, raw exhaustion of a grueling labor, but my mind had never been sharper. I shifted my weight, grasped Devin's forearm, and lowered myself carefully into the chair. I smoothed the lapels of my dark cashmere wrap, adjusting my posture until I sat perfectly straight. I might have been confined to a wheelchair mere hours postpartum, but I radiated the absolute unyielding authority of an executioner overseeing the final strike. Bradley's initial shock rapidly boiled over into a blind, charging fury. He lunged toward the SUV, closing the distance with heavy, stomping strides, his face twisted in a mask of pure venom. He pointed a shaking finger at my face, demanding to know what kind of deranged illegal stunt I was pulling. He screamed at the top of his lungs, demanding to know how I had managed to lock him out of his own house, his property, his kingdom. He gestured frantically at the armed guards on the porch, ordering me to call off my hired thugs before he had me arrested for trespassing, grand larceny, and harassment. Thomas and Catherine hurried up behind him, flanking their son like outraged aristocratic bodyguards. They squawked about their sacred family rights. Catherine pointing an accusing manicured finger and calling me a hysterical, vindictive woman who was completely out of her mind. Standing near the edge of the driveway, Brittany clutched Leo tightly, her previous excitement entirely replaced by a dawning, terrified realization that the fairy tale she had been promised was actively burning to the ground. I did not raise my voice to match Bradley's manic hysteria. I did not even bother making eye contact with my former in-laws. I simply rested my hands calmly in my lap and offered Devin a single subtle nod. Devin stepped smoothly in front of my chair, his towering frame forming an impenetrable solid wall between me and my furious husband. From the interior pocket of his tailored coat, Devin extracted a crisp blue legal folder. He opened it slowly, pulling out two heavily stamped notarized documents and held them up for Bradley to see. Devin's voice sliced through the crisp morning air, cold, precise, and utterly devoid of pity. He formally presented the immediate foreclosure notice alongside the finalized court-ordered eviction mandate. Bradley stared at the thick, terrifying seals on the paper, his mouth opening and closing without producing a sound. Devin calmly explained the exact architecture of my trap, ensuring every single word landed like a physical blow. Months ago, when Bradley was desperately siphoning our marital funds to maintain Brittany's luxury lifestyle and cover his mounting gambling debts, he had secretly taken out a massive, highly illegal secondary loan against the equity of this exact suburban estate. He had forged my signature on the underwriting, assuming I would never notice the missing equity. Devin revealed the fatal flaw in Bradley's arrogant plan. The private financial institution that had purchased that toxic high-interest debt was not a faceless corporate bank. It was a blind LLC entirely owned, funded, and operated by me. I had quietly bought his fraudulent debt for pennies on the dollar, holding it silently in the dark while he continued to dig his own grave. Devin delivered the final lethal mechanism of the trap. He detailed how the asset freeze he had initiated at the hospital had instantly frozen all of Bradley's accounts, causing his automatic loan payment to bounce hard. That single missed payment triggered a draconian default clause hidden deep within the secondary loan's terms. Because Bradley had defaulted, my blind LLC exercised its immediate, unquestionable legal right to foreclose and seize the underlying asset. Devin stepped closer, his voice dropping to a low, crushing register as he informed Bradley that this estate no longer belonged to him, nor did it belong to any shared marital trust. It was now the sole exclusive corporate property of my holding company. He explained that Bradley was not standing in his driveway, but rather actively trespassing on my corporate property. The guards on the porch were not an intimidation tactic, but my rightful legal security team enforcing a lawful eviction. The horrific reality finally shattered the last remaining pieces of Bradley's ego. He was completely bankrupt, his credit was dead, his pristine reputation was hours away from federal indictment, and as he stood on the cold cobblestones staring at his garbage on the curb, he realized he was effectively, legally, and permanently homeless. Bradley remained paralyzed on the driveway, the total destruction of his life pinning him to the damp cobblestones like a heavy, suffocating weight. He stared blankly at the scattered remnants of his bachelorhood, completely incapable of formulating a response to the devastating reality Devin had just laid bare. Seeing his golden child brought so low, stripped of his power and property, by a woman he deemed inferior, ignited a volcanic eruption within Thomas. The older man could not compute this absolute inversion of the natural hierarchy he had worshipped his entire life. He stormed past the discarded boxes, kicking a stray golf club out of his path, his face flushing a dangerous mottled purple. Catherine scurried nervously behind her husband, clutching her designer handbag against her chest like a shield. She cast panicked, frantic glances toward the neighboring estates, utterly mortified by the public spectacle unfolding on the manicured lawns. She whimpered about the irreparable damage this would do to their sterling reputation at the country club, but Thomas completely ignored her. He planted his polished leather shoes firmly on the driveway directly in front of my wheelchair and unleashed a torrent of pure, unadulterated misogyny. He pointed a trembling, rage-filled finger directly at my face, his voice booming with the aggressive entitlement of a man who had never once been told no. He screamed that my actions were a disgraceful, hysterical rebellion. He loudly declared that a wife's singular sacred duty was to stand by her husband, to offer blind obedience and unwavering loyalty, regardless of whatever minor, insignificant indiscretions he might have committed. He branded me a treacherous, ungrateful woman who was actively destroying a prestigious bloodline out of pure, spiteful jealousy. He bellowed that I was entirely out of my depth, playing a dangerous game of corporate warfare that I lacked the intellect and the pedigree to understand. I sat perfectly still, letting his archaic, vitriolic insults wash over me without absorbing a single drop of their poison. Devon remained planted at my side, his imposing presence a silent testament to my absolute security. Thomas, mistaking our composed silence for intimidation, puffed out his chest desperately, attempting to reclaim the role of the dominant, untouchable patriarch. He shifted his furious glare away from me and focused his wrath entirely on Devon, sizing up the towering attorney with profound aristocratic disgust. Thomas warned Devon that he had just made a catastrophic, career-ending miscalculation by aligning himself with a vindictive, unstable ex-wife. He sneered, mocking Devon's tailored suit and calm demeanor, promising to obliterate his professional reputation. Thomas aggressively boasted about his limitless resources, his voice echoing loudly across the property line. He proudly invoked the massive multi-million-dollar family investment fund, wielding it like a heavy, blunt weapon. He swore on his family name that he would immediately authorize the liquidation of whatever capital was necessary to hire the most vicious, predatory, and ruthless legal defense team in the entire state. He painted a bleak, terrifying picture of our future, promising to drag this dispute through every appellate court in the jurisdiction. He vowed to bury me under an endless, suffocating avalanche of injunctions, appeals, and punitive litigation until my blind holding company was entirely bankrupt. He threatened to drain every last cent I possessed, promising to leave me destitute, broken, and begging on my knees for a fraction of the mercy I had just denied his son. Thomas leaned in his face, contorted with malice, and assured Devon that he would personally see to it that his boutique law firm was systematically crushed into dust, reporting him to the ethics board and driving him out of the legal profession forever. The air crackled with the heavy, aggressive energy of his ultimatum. Brittany stood in the background, a faint glimmer of hope returning to her eyes as she watched the wealthy patriarch step up to defend their stolen empire. Catherine nodded vigorously, entirely supportive of her husband's promise to financially annihilate the mother of her newborn granddaughter. They all waited for the inevitable surrender, fully expecting me to cower under the immense, crushing weight of their generational wealth and institutional power. I did not flinch. I did not break eye contact. The sheer, unadulterated arrogance of his threats did not instill a single ounce of fear in my heart. Instead, a deep, thrilling wave of anticipation curled through my chest. The physical exhaustion of my recent labor vanished entirely, replaced by the sharp electric adrenaline of a hunter watching its prey willingly step directly into the center of a fatal snare. Devon did not react to the barrage of professional threats. He simply adjusted his silver cufflinks. His dark eyes locked onto Thomas, with a look of mild clinical amusement waiting for my signal. I leaned forward in my wheelchair, closing the physical distance between us. The compliant, quiet daughter-in-law they had grossly underestimated for years was dead and buried. In her place sat a woman who had meticulously orchestrated their complete destruction. A slow, predatory smile spread across my face, sharp and totally unyielding. I maintained a steady, unwavering gaze, watching the absolute certainty burning in Thomas's eyes. I kept my voice low, carrying a lethal, icy calm that instantly silenced the remaining echoes of his blustering rage. I acknowledged his grand speech, telling him that it was a truly terrifying threat. I let the silence hang for a fraction of a second, letting the weight of my utter lack of intimidation settle over the group. Then I delivered the final, devastating pivot. I tilted my head slightly, my smile widening into something genuinely dangerous. I asked him directly, stating that his plan to unleash his massive wealth was fascinating, but I needed him to clarify one very specific detail. I asked him to tell me exactly what investment fund he was planning to use. Thomas blinked, the absolute certainty in my voice causing a brief involuntary stutter in his tirade. His brow furrowed in deep, genuine confusion, completely unable to process the calm superiority radiating from my wheelchair. He quickly recovered, his face flushing with renewed indignant rage as he tried to dismiss my question as pure insolence. He loudly reiterated the name of his prestigious generational family trust, boasting that it was an impenetrable fortress of wealth that had survived market crashes and recessions for decades. He sneered, stating that a simple housewife could not possibly comprehend the sheer magnitude of the capital he had at his immediate disposal. I did not bother arguing with his arrogant bluster. I simply turned my head slightly and offered Devin a slow, deliberate nod. Devin retrieved his smartphone from his tailored coat pocket. He did not ask Thomas for permission, nor did he offer any explanation. He simply tapped the screen, activated the speakerphone, and held the device up in the crisp morning air. The dial tone echoed sharply across the quiet driveway, cutting right through the heavy, suffocating tension. After 3 rings, a voice answered. It was Gregory, the senior wealth manager and chief accountant, who had overseen the family's financial empire for over 20 years. He was a man who typically spoke in confident, measured financial jargon, but today his voice sounded thin, breathless, and deeply terrified. Thomas immediately recognized the voice. He stepped forward aggressively, demanding to know why his personal accountant was on speakerphone with my attorney. He ordered Gregory to hang up the phone instantly, insisting this was a gross violation of confidentiality and a breach of his fiduciary duty. Devin bypassed the older man's outrage entirely. His voice was a calm, authoritative command that brokered absolutely no interruption. He formally instructed Gregory to report the initial findings of the emergency morning audit, the deep forensic dive that had been automatically triggered across all associated accounts, the moment my asset freeze injunction hit the banking system. Gregory hesitated, the silence on the line stretching painfully across the driveway. Thomas shouted another threat at the phone, promising to fire the accountant before the day was out. I leaned forward in my wheelchair, my gaze locked onto my former father-in-law. I calmly reminded Thomas that because my name was legally tied to the overarching corporate holding structures Bradley had manipulated to fund his lifestyle, I had every right to initiate a forensic trace of all commingled capital. I informed him that the trace had not stopped at my marital checking accounts. It had followed the digital paper trail all the way to the source. Gregory finally broke. His voice cracked as he delivered the horrific, inescapable reality live on the speakerphone. He stammered out that the untouchable family investment fund Thomas had just threatened to weaponize against me no longer existed in any meaningful capacity. Thomas scoffed loudly, a harsh, dismissive sound. He called the statement utterly impossible, aggressively insisting that he had personally reviewed the quarterly statements in his home office just last week. He boasted that the reserves were healthy, robust, and completely secure. The accountant's response was a brutal verbal execution. Gregory confessed that those pristine quarterly statements were meticulously fabricated. He detailed the absolute systemic financial slaughter Bradley had orchestrated. Utilizing his executive access and exploiting the blind trust his father had placed in him, Bradley had forged Thomas's signature on a series of complex high-level wire transfers over the past 18 months. He had not merely embezzled from his corporate clients or drained my personal savings. He had systematically gutted his own parents' generational wealth. Gregory revealed that over $2 million had been completely liquidated and siphoned directly out of Thomas and Catherine's secure retirement reserves and the primary family trusts. Thomas's face turned a sickening ashen gray. The aggressive posture vanished instantly, his shoulders sagging as the crushing gravity of the accountant's words slammed into him. He demanded to know where the capital had gone, his voice dropping to a desperate, raspy whisper, blindly grasping at the hope of a terrible market investment or a failed business venture. Devon provided the answer. He pulled a thick stack of bank ledgers from his blue folder, reading the brutal, itemized list aloud for everyone on the driveway to hear. The missing $2 million had not been invested. It had been funneled through dummy corporations and directly routed to sustain Bradley's secret double life. Devon listed the exorbitant penthouse leases, the imported luxury SUVs, the six-figure designer shopping sprees, and the heavy, constant flow of hush money required to keep Brittany living like royalty. Bradley had literally burned his parents' entire secure future to the ground just to maintain the illusion of his own corporate supremacy and keep his mistress entertained. The shockwave hit the older couple with devastating physical force. Catherine let out a sharp, breathless gasp. Her heavy designer handbag slipped from her manicured fingers, hitting the cobblestone driveway with a dull, heavy thud. Her aristocratic facade crumbled in a fraction of a second, entirely replaced by the sheer, unadulterated terror of sudden, inescapable financial ruin. Thomas staggered backward, clutching his chest as if he had been shot. The untouchable family wealth he had worshipped his entire life, the ultimate weapon he had just tried to wield to destroy me, had been vaporized by his own golden boy. Bradley stood completely frozen next to his pile of discarded garbage on the curb, his jaw hanging slack. He weakly raised his hands, trying to stammer out a pathetic defense, whispering that it was only a temporary loan, a bridge gap, and that he was planning to replace the capital before anyone ever noticed. He looked toward his father, instinctively expecting the usual unconditional bailout, the familiar protective shield that had covered his mistakes since childhood. But as Thomas stared back at his son, there was no protection left in his eyes. There was only profound, disgusted horror. Standing a few feet away, Brittany pulled her toddler closer to her chest. The triumphant, entitled glow completely vanished from her features. The endless stream of cash, the luxurious estate, the powerful family backing she thought she had secured were all part of a spectacular, fraudulent illusion. She looked at Bradley, the terrible realization crystallizing in her wide eyes. She was not inheriting a kingdom. She was shackled to a broke, homeless criminal who had just robbed his own parents blind, and the walls were rapidly closing in around them all. The profound, disgusted horror in Thomas's eyes did not remain passive for long. The pristine, highly cultivated veneer of the aristocratic patriarch instantly shattered completely, overridden by a raw, primal, and entirely unhinged rage. Thomas let out a guttural, furious roar that tore through the quiet suburban morning, a sound completely alien to a man who prided himself on quiet country club civility. He surged forward, closing the distance between himself and his son in 3 heavy, stomping strides. Before Bradley could even raise his hands in a pathetic attempt to defend himself, Thomas lunged. He grabbed the wide lapels of Bradley's expensive, custom-tailored suit jacket, twisting the fine Italian wool tightly into his fists, and violently shoved his son backward. Bradley stumbled, his designer leather shoes slipping awkwardly against the damp cobblestones. His arms flailed uselessly as he crashed directly into the pile of discarded gym bags and cardboard boxes resting on the curb. Thomas did not relent. He stood over his sprawling, terrified son, a lifetime of elitist restraint entirely incinerated by the brutal, unforgiving reality of his stolen retirement. He screamed, his voice cracking and spit flying from his lips, demanding to know how his own flesh and blood could commit such a heinous, unforgivable betrayal. He bellowed about decades of meticulous financial planning, the sacred family trusts, and the generational wealth he had ruthlessly protected for his entire life. All of it instantly vaporized to fund a cheap, vulgar double life and a mistress's shopping sprees. Catherine's initial paralyzing shock melted into a hysterical weeping frenzy. The impeccably groomed matriarch completely lost her mind. She stumbled forward, her expensive high heels snapping against the pavement, entirely ignoring her dropped designer handbag lying in the dirt. Tears streamed down her face, ruining her perfect makeup and leaving dark, jagged streaks of mascara across her pale cheeks. She threw herself into the dirt beside her son, her manicured hands slapping wildly and repeatedly against Bradley's chest and shoulders. She wailed a high-pitched, keening sound of pure despair, screaming about her vanished security and the absolute, inescapable public humiliation they were about to endure. She sobbed that he had ruined them forever, that they would be a laughingstock, destitute outcasts in the very social circles they had once ruled with an iron fist. The scene devolved into a vicious, brawling mess right on the edge of the manicured front lawn. The wealthy, untouchable family had been reduced to a violent, screaming spectacle, clawing and shoving at each other among the scattered debris of Bradley's pre-marriage garbage. Devon stood perfectly still beside my wheelchair, his hands resting casually in his coat pockets. He did not intervene, nor did he signal the security contractors to step down from the porch and break up the fight. We simply watched the magnificent, overdue implosion, completely insulated from their chaotic civil war. Bradley scrambled backward on the wet grass, desperately trying to shield his face from his mother's frantic slaps and his father's furious kicking boots. He whined and pleaded, his voice a pathetic nasal squeak, begging them to calm down and promising he could fix the missing millions, a delusional promise that only fueled their violent, unyielding outrage. Watching her affluent, luxurious future violently evaporate before her very eyes, Brittany finally snapped. The sheer terrifying realization that her wealthy golden goose was actually a bankrupt, hated criminal ignited a desperate, shrill panic within her. She refused to go back to a cramped apartment. She refused to lose the promised estate. She shoved her fussy toddler higher onto her hip and marched aggressively into the center of the fray, her high heels sinking into the soft turf. She shrieked at the top of her lungs, a harsh grating sound that momentarily pierced through Thomas and Catherine's screaming match. She demanded that they step back immediately and stop attacking her fiancé. Her face was flushed dark red, her eyes wide with a feral, cornered desperation. When Thomas turned his furious, bloodshot eyes toward her, clearly ready to unleash his absolute wrath on the very mistress who had drained his retirement accounts, Brittany puffed out her chest. She stood her ground and played what she firmly believed was her ultimate, undeniable trump card. She pointed a trembling, manicured finger at the older couple, her voice echoing sharply across the expansive lawn. She ordered them to show her some respect. She loudly, arrogantly declared that they needed to back off, forgive Bradley, and pool whatever meager resources they had left to protect them, because she was the mother of his child. She hoisted little Leo toward them, parading the confused toddler like a royal shield. She screamed that this boy was the only male heir this prestigious family would ever produce. She demanded that Thomas recognize his duty to his bloodline, insisting that her child's status completely insulated her from their financial collapse. She boldly proclaimed that as the mother of the next generation's patriarch, she demanded immediate shelter, legal protection, and the total respect her position dictated. Brittany's arrogant, entitled declaration echoed across the expansive, perfectly manicured lawn, bouncing off the heavy brick facade of my newly secured estate. The sheer audacity of her demand forced a sudden, stunned silence over the brawling family. Thomas froze, his fists still tightly clenched in Bradley's ruined suit jacket, his chest heaving as he stared at the toddler. Catherine stopped weeping, her breath catching in her throat as she looked up from the grass, staring at the young woman demanding tribute. Bradley looked up from the dirt, a desperate, pathetic glimmer of hope washing over his bruised face as he silently prayed his son would be the undeniable key to his salvation. I let that heavy, suffocating silence hang in the crisp morning air for a long, agonizing moment. I wanted Brittany to feel the absolute peak of her false power. I wanted Thomas and Catherine to grasp desperately at the illusion of their continuing bloodline. I wanted Bradley to believe for one fraction of a second that he had a singular remaining lifeline. Then, moving with deliberate, unhurried precision, I reached down and calmly unzipped the main compartment of my black leather tote bag resting in my lap. The sharp metallic sound of the zipper cut clearly through the quiet driveway. Without breaking my gaze from Brittany's defiant, flushed face, I reached inside. My fingers bypassed my wallet and my phone wrapping securely around a thick, premium piece of stationery. I pulled out a stark white, heavy stock envelope. The pristine paper was completely unmarked save for a deep crimson wax seal, pressed firmly onto the back flap, the unmistakable, highly confidential emblem of the state's most exclusive private genetics and paternity lab. I lifted the envelope by its corner, holding it up so the morning sunlight caught the texture of the premium paper. The crimson wax gleamed like a drop of fresh blood against the stark white background. Brittany's shrill, desperate demands for respect still echoed off the grand limestone facade of my home, a pathetic, dying vibration against the reality of her impending doom. She had built her entire grift on the ancient, outdated premise that producing a male heir would cement her permanent position within an aristocratic dynasty. It was a classic desperate maneuver, a gold digger's absolute last resort, when the luxury cars, the endless shopping sprees, and the penthouse leases started to violently evaporate. I looked directly into her terrified eyes, my expression a mask of absolute chilling serenity. I told Brittany that her sudden devotion to the patriarchal bloodline was truly touching, if not entirely predictable. I acknowledged how heavily she had relied on this child, how she had weaponized an innocent toddler using him as a human shield and an unlimited ATM to drain millions of dollars from a family she secretly despised. Thomas and Catherine stared at the heavy paper in my hand, their breathing shallow, paralyzed by the sheer unyielding authority I projected from my wheelchair. Bradley pushed himself up onto his knees, wiping damp earth from his ruined trousers, his eyes darting frantically between my face and his mistress. He was clinging to the delusional fantasy that I was simply bluffing, hoping against hope that his legacy, his one tangible contribution to the family name, would somehow survive this massacre. I did not grant him that mercy. With a sharp, deliberate flick of my thumb, I broke the crimson wax seal. The thick paper tore with a crisp, satisfying sound that caused Brittany to visibly flinch, her shoulders hiking up toward her ears. I pulled the heavy watermarked document from the envelope and unfolded it, slowly smoothing the creases with calculated care against my lap. I announced that before we got into the final, irrefutable numbers, it was vital they understood the absolute, undeniable chain of custody involved in this revelation. I reminded Brittany of the day she had so boldly paraded through my home, arrogantly measuring my drapes and picking out paint colors for a nursery she assumed was rightfully hers. I detailed how, in her blind haste to claim my territory and assert her dominance, she had carelessly left little Leo's plastic juice cup sitting directly on my pristine kitchen island. She gasped, her face draining of all color, her grip tightening so fiercely around the child in her arms that he began to squirm and fuss. I explained that Devon had immediately secured that cup the second she walked out the door, bagging the item with the clinical, uncontaminated precision of a crime scene investigator. Then I turned my gaze down to Bradley, who was still kneeling in the damp grass, trembling like a beaten dog. I reminded him of the morning I had officially banished him from the master suite, noting that in his sloppy, frantic rush to pack his overnight bag, he had left his favorite silver razor resting on the marble vanity. Two entirely separate items collected from two entirely distinct locations, both heavily laced with the necessary biological markers to uncover the ultimate, devastating truth. I informed the ruined family that those two items had been hand-delivered to the most exclusive, utterly incorruptible private genetics laboratory in the region. There was no room for error, no possibility of cross-contamination, and absolutely no margin for legal dispute. I held the document up my voice, carrying the steady, resonant authority of an executioner delivering a final, unappealable sentence. I began to read the executive summary aloud, my words striking the silent driveway like physical blows. I read through the complex clinical jargon, ensuring every single syllable landed with maximum punishing impact. I detailed the exact number of genetic markers tested, the advanced sequencing utilized by the lab, and the rigorous control standards implemented to guarantee total accuracy. I paused, letting the heavy scientific reality suffocate their last remaining hopes. I looked at Thomas, watching the arrogant patriarch's chest heave with shallow, panicked breaths. He was a man who worshipped data, who built his entire life on concrete numbers, balance sheets, and empirical facts, and he knew exactly what was coming. He knew that the paper in my hands was not a threat or a negotiation tactic. It was an absolute, immutable verdict that could never be undone. I shifted my focus back to Brittany. Her lower lip trembled violently, her eyes darting frantically around the estate as if searching for an escape route that simply did not exist. The walls had completely closed in on her. I read the final bolded conclusion at the bottom of the page, my voice dropping to a low, lethal register that sliced through the crisp morning air. Probability of paternity 0.00%. I let the number hang there, savoring the absolute destruction it wrought. I stated the undeniable, brutal fact plainly, so there could be no misinterpretation. Leo was not Bradley's son. He never was, and he never would be. The entire foundation of Brittany's luxury lifestyle, the millions of dollars stolen from the family trust, the penthouse, the cars, the lavish promises of a future empire, all of it had been built on a monumental calculating fraud. Brittany had been playing Bradley for an absolute fool since the very first day they met. She had targeted a weak, arrogant man with deep pockets and profound daddy issues, deliberately using another man's child as the ultimate bait to secure a fortune she had absolutely no right to claim. The profound, suffocating silence that followed my declaration was absolute perfection, a fitting monument to their total annihilation. The profound, suffocating silence that followed my declaration was absolute perfection, a fitting monument to their total annihilation. The stark numeric reality of the genetic test struck Bradley not as a mere psychological revelation, but as a violent, crushing physical blow. The last remaining traces of color drained entirely from his face, leaving his skin a sickly, translucent gray. His body simply quit. His legs ceased functioning, folding beneath him like severed strings on a marionette. He crumpled downward, his knees hitting the damp grass with a heavy, muted thud. He stared blankly at the dark earth, his mind desperately trying to process the catastrophic arithmetic of his own irreversible ruin. The horrifying timeline of his double life played out in his wide, unblinking eyes. Every single piece of his treacherous, arrogant puzzle rapidly assembled into a gruesome, inescapable picture. The massive multi-million-dollar embezzlement, the systematic and permanent destruction of his pristine corporate career, the cruel and callous betrayal of his heavily pregnant wife, the ruthless, calculated bankruptcy of his own parents, every single despicable act he had executed with such smug superiority had been for an absolute lie. He had gleefully burned his entire universe to ash, destroyed his marriage, and stolen his family's financial security, all to build an extravagant empire for another man's child. A hollow, broken gasp tore from his throat, a pathetic, ragged sound of a man watching his ego and his future simultaneously disintegrate into dust. The magnitude of his stupidity was a physical weight pressing him face first into the mud. Above his kneeling form, Brittany's aggressive bravado shattered into a million jagged, useless pieces. Her carefully constructed facade of the untouchable matriarch in waiting dissolved, revealing the panicked, cornered grifter beneath. She opened her mouth desperately, trying to spin a new web of deceit to invent a plausible excuse on the spot. She wanted to scream about a corrupted lab sample, a clerical error, a malicious illegal setup orchestrated by a jealous ex-wife. But the words died in her throat. she stammered, emitting only sharp, breathless squeaks as her eyes darted wildly, seeking any avenue of escape from the circle of destruction. The sheer naked terror etched across her features was the ultimate confirmation, louder and more definitive than any notarized document Devon could ever produce. She knew she was caught. Her golden ticket was entirely counterfeit, and the limitless vault she had been bleeding dry had just snapped permanently shut. She clutched the toddler against her chest, stepping backward, realizing that the child was no longer a shield, but the living proof of her monumental fraud. Behind her, the older generation collapsed under the sheer brutal force of the biological bomb. Catherine let out a short, choked gasp, her eyes rolling back into her head as the horrific reality of the scandal fractured her fragile aristocratic mind. Her knees buckled and she collapsed backward, fainting dead away into her husband's arms in a heap of crumpled designer fabric. Thomas barely managed to catch her, his own body trembling violently under the sudden dead weight of his unconscious wife. He lowered Catherine to the lawn, his chest heaving as he visibly struggled to pull air into his lungs. The proud, untouchable patriarch who just moments prior had threatened to crush me with his boundless resources and powerful lawyers now knelt on the wet grass, blindly grasping at the collar of his shirt. The sacred, immaculate family legacy he had obsessed over for decades, the pure aristocratic bloodline he had sacrificed his own moral compass to protect, was entirely reduced to ashes. The grand dynasty he thought he was securing ended right there on the wet turf, extinguished not by corporate rivals, but by a cheap, predictable grift and the monumental arrogance of a gullible son. Devon stood tall and impassive by my side, a silent sentinel overseeing the wreckage. Through the tinted window of the SUV, I knew Rachel was watching, holding Emma close, witnessing the absolute vindication of our shared struggle. I looked down at the broken, miserable shell of the man I had once married. Bradley remained on his knees, his expensive suit soaked with mud and morning dew, his hands digging aimlessly into the soil. His shoulders shook with silent, tearless sobs of pure, unadulterated self-pity. There was not a single shred of sympathy left within my heart, only the cold, precise satisfaction of justice perfectly executed. I leaned forward in my wheelchair, ignoring the dull ache in my healing body, ensuring my voice was the only sound cutting through the morning air. My tone was cold, precise, and razor-sharp, leaving absolutely no room for misinterpretation. I commanded him to look at me, refusing to let him hide his face from the reality he had so actively chosen. Slowly, agonizingly, Bradley lifted his head. His tear-streaked, mud-spattered face was a portrait of total devastation. His eyes were hollow, stripped of all the smug superiority he had worn like armor for years. Meeting his broken gaze, I echoed the exact unforgiving words he had spoken in the sterile chill of my hospital recovery room. I asked him if he remembered that specific moment. I asked if he remembered the exact second he stood over my hospital bed staring at the monitors and actively refused to hold my newborn daughter because he was too busy rushing off to cater to his so-called real son. The memory hung heavy and suffocating between us. I told him that I had explicitly warned him to remember that choice, to remember the exact feeling of walking away from his true family. I stated clearly, letting each word land with maximum lethal impact, that the reason he needed to carve that memory into his mind was because Emma was the only person standing on this entire estate who actually shares his blood. The finality of my words seemed to snap the remaining frayed threads of Bradley's sanity. For a second, he remained entirely motionless on the damp earth, a broken shell staring at nothing. Then, a terrifying manic energy convulsed through his posture. He slowly lifted his face, but he wasn't looking at me anymore. His bloodshot eyes locked onto Brittany, who was still frozen on the edge of the lawn, clutching the toddler like a stolen shield. A guttural, unhinged screech tore from Bradley's throat, a sound born from the absolute realization that he had sacrificed his life, his status, and his career for a meticulously orchestrated lie. With a sudden explosive burst of desperate rage, he scrambled to his feet and lunged directly toward her, his fingers curling into predatory claws. The pristine manicured driveway descended into sheer chaotic violence. Brittany shrieked in terror, spinning around to protect herself, but Bradley was completely blinded by madness. He reached her in two heavy, stomping strides, his hands violently clawing at her silk blouse, and the straps of her designer handbag demanding to know who the real father was, screaming that she had destroyed him. The toddler began to wail in absolute panic as the physical struggle intensified. Seeing his son completely cross the line into public assault, Thomas was forced to act. The elderly patriarch, despite struggling for his own breath moments before, threw his body into the fray. He surged forward, wrapping his arms around Bradley's waist, using his remaining physical weight to pull his son backward, desperately trying to prevent a domestic battery charge from unfolding right on the curb of an affluent neighborhood. Bradley thrashed wildly against his father's grip, his custom-tailored suit jacket tearing at the seams as he kicked and struck out, completely feral, entirely consumed by the ultimate betrayal. Suddenly, a piercing, high-pitched wail cut cleanly through the upper-class morning air, completely drowning out the family's screaming match. The sharp mechanical screech of tires echoed from the main thoroughfare, and within seconds, 3 marked police cruisers and 2 imposing black unmarked SUVs careened onto the quiet suburban street. They didn't slow down as they approached the property lines. Instead, they aggressively mounted the curb, the heavy tires tearing into the manicured grass, as they formed a strategic interlocking blockade directly across the mouth of the driveway, completely sealing off any possible route of escape. The heavy doors of the unmarked SUVs flew open with a synchronous metallic thud before the vehicles had even come to a complete halt. A team of stern, stone-faced federal agents in crisp, tactical vests stepped out into the morning light, their movements synchronized and thoroughly practiced. They did not draw weapons, but their posture carried the absolute unyielding weight of the United States government. They marched directly into the center of the driveway, their heavy combat boots crunching authoritatively against the gravel, effortlessly parting the brawling, disheveled family. Thomas instantly let go of his son, stepping back with his hands raised in instinctual submission, while Brittany collapsed into a weeping heap on the turf, realizing her calculated game had officially reached its permanent end. The lead federal agent stepped directly into Bradley's line of sight, pulling a heavy leather wallet from his interior pocket and flashing a gold federal shield that gleamed under the gray morning sky. He called out Bradley's full name, his voice echoing with a chilling professional neutrality that instantly froze the remaining adrenaline in my ex-husband's veins. Bradley stood panting, his hair matted with sweat and dirt, staring blankly at the badge as the agent coolly informed him that he was officially under arrest. The clinical execution of this raid was the direct result of the precise digital trigger I had set the previous night. The delayed automated email I had scheduled to hit the central servers of the Securities and Exchange Commission and the Federal Bureau of Investigation at exactly 8 a.m. had found its mark with flawless, devastating efficiency. The federal authorities hadn't just received a casual tip, they had been blindsided by a masterfully compiled, entirely indisputable digital guillotine. The sheer volume of forensic accounting databank routing numbers and shell company registries contained within my encrypted dossier left absolutely no room for an internal corporate investigation or a lengthy legal review. The undeniable proof of systematic multi-million-dollar corporate embezzlement and interstate wire fraud was so massive, and the evidence of his imminent flight risk so clear, that it had taken the federal prosecutors less than an hour to secure a signed emergency arrest warrant from a federal magistrate judge. 2 tactical agents stepped forward, moving behind Bradley with practiced, unhurried precision. Before he could even formulate a plea or look toward his father for a legal rescue, they grabbed his wrists, bringing his arms roughly behind his back. The sharp metallic click of handcuffs ratcheting tightly around his wrists snapped through the morning air, a sound that officially signaled the total and permanent collapse of his house of cards. The aristocrat who had spent his entire life looking down on the world was now just an anonymous federal defendant, stripped of his custom, tailoring his stolen millions, and his family name. I sat perfectly still in my wheelchair, my hands resting calmly on the folder in my lap, watching the final pieces of my strategic plan fall into place. Devin stood beside me, his face an impenetrable mask of victory, while the security contractors on the porch quietly observed the federal agents escorting a weeping, broken Bradley toward the rear of the leading black SUV. The wealthy, untouchable dynasty that had arrived at my gates to demand tribute was now nothing more than a ruined, fractured spectacle on a public street. I looked past the flashing red and blue lights of the police cruisers, my heart entirely steady knowing that every single variable had been accounted for, and the ultimate reckoning had only just begun. The federal agent did not offer Bradley the courtesy of a gentle escort. With a swift, practiced motion, the agent spun my ex-husband around and forcefully pressed him against the cold, unforgiving hood of the marked police cruiser. The sharp metallic impact echoed down the quiet street, a jarring punctuation mark to the end of his privileged existence. His cheek was smashed flat against the pristine white paint of the patrol car, distorting his features into a grotesque mask of panic and disbelief. The agent's voice was a flat, authoritative drone reciting the Miranda rights with a practiced cadence that offered absolutely no room for negotiation or charm. Bradley tried to squirm his mouth opening to unleash a barrage of elite entitlement to demand his lawyer to scream about his family's status, but the heavy pressure of the agent's forearm pinned between his shoulder blades instantly silenced him. The spectacle was absolute. Up and down the expansive, tree-lined street, front doors slowly crept open. The neurosurgeon from next door, the hedge fund manager from across the cul-de-sac, and the various tech executives who populated this exclusive enclave stepped out onto their perfectly manicured lawns. They stood in their silk robes, clutching expensive morning coffees, watching in stunned, silent fascination as the neighborhood's most arrogant resident was publicly dismantled. Bradley's profound humiliation was finally complete, broadcast live to the very social circle he had spent his entire life desperately trying to impress. A few feet away, Brittany's shrill protests were abruptly cut short. A stern female federal agent had secured a firm, inescapable grip on her arm, physically separating her from the toddler. Brittany shrieked, demanding to be treated with respect, but the agent was entirely unmoved by the theatrical display of maternal panic. She coldly informed Brittany that she was being detained for intense federal questioning regarding her direct receipt possession and laundering of millions in stolen corporate funds. The designer handbag she clung to, the expensive jewelry dripping from her wrists, and the keys to the luxury penthouse were all swiftly confiscated, bagged, and tagged as federal evidence. The reality of federal prison of trading her stolen luxury for a concrete cell finally crashed over her. She stopped fighting, her face going slack, as she was securely guided toward the back of a second unmarked SUV. Just beyond the flashing red and blue lights, Thomas and Catherine were left entirely alone, physically and financially broken. The untouchable aristocratic patriarch and his meticulously groomed wife had literally been reduced to sitting on the hard, cold concrete curb. Catherine stared vacantly at the asphalt, her makeup smeared, her mind entirely unable to process the absolute incineration of her golden years. Thomas sat slumped forward, his head resting heavily in his trembling hands. The generational wealth, the sacred trusts, the country club memberships, and the legacy he had ruthlessly protected were gone, vaporized by the very sun he had elevated above all else. They were destitute, disgraced, and utterly irrelevant. I did not stay to watch them load Bradley into the back of the cruiser. There was no need to gloat, no desire to linger in the toxic fumes of their destruction. The victory was absolute, and my interest in their existence had officially expired. I looked up at Devon and gave him a single subtle nod. He moved instantly, grasping the handles of my wheelchair and smoothly turning me away from the chaos. We moved toward the driveway where a sleek armored SUV was already idling its engine, a low, powerful purr. The rear doors opened and Devon expertly guided me onto the automated ramp. Inside the cavernous, climate-controlled cabin, Rachel was waiting. She sat in the plush leather seat holding a sleeping Emma securely against her chest. I settled into the space beside them, the specialized locks engaging around my chair with a reassuring click. Outside, Bradley caught sight of my departure. He threw his body against the grip of the federal agents, his face twisting in absolute primal desperation. He screamed my name, a ragged, pathetic sound tearing from his throat, begging for a mercy he had never once shown me. I pressed a button on the armrest. The heavy bulletproof tinted windows slid smoothly upward. The thick acoustic glass sealed completely instantly, severing his voice, cutting off his pathetic pleas, and drowning out the wail of the sirens. The cabin fell into a profound, immaculate silence. Devon slid into the driver's seat, put the vehicle in gear, and we accelerated smoothly away from the curb, leaving the smoldering wreckage of my past permanently behind us. 1 year later, the morning sun broke brilliantly over the icy expanse of Lake Michigan, flooding my expansive corner office with sharp, golden light. I sat behind a massive desk carved from solid obsidian, looking out through the floor-to-ceiling windows that offered an uninterrupted commanding view of the Chicago skyline. The wheelchair was gone, replaced by a sleek, custom-designed executive chair that supported my fully healed spine. I had taken the brutal, agonizing lessons of my past and weaponized them, forging a new reality from the ashes of my old one. I was now the founder and acting CEO of the most aggressive, highly sought-after forensic accounting and asset recovery firm in the Midwest. My firm did not cater to standard corporate audits. We specialized exclusively in the absolute dismantling of financial abusers. We represented spouses who had been lied to, women who had been financially suffocated, and partners who had been told they were crazy while their assets were quietly siphoned away into offshore accounts and hidden shell companies. I employed a ruthless elite team of former federal investigators, digital forensic experts, and unyielding litigators. We tracked every stolen cent, pierced every corporate veil, and delivered the same devastating, unappealable justice I had orchestrated against Bradley. I had transformed my survival into an empire, building a fortress of steel and data that no man would ever breach again. The heavy oak doors to my office swung open with a soft, practiced click. I looked up from a heavily encrypted financial dossier to see Devon stepping into the room. He was dressed in a sharp, immaculate charcoal suit, having transitioned seamlessly from my personal security contractor to the firm's director of operations. Right behind him walked Rachel, her face glowing with a bright, unburdened smile. But it was the little girl holding tightly to Rachel's hands that made my heart instantly warm. Emma was 1 year old, a thriving, vibrant toddler with bright, intelligent eyes and a mop of soft, dark curls. She babbled happily, her tiny feet stepping confidently across the thick carpeting as Rachel guided her toward my desk. She was the absolute picture of health, joy, and profound innocence, completely insulated from the toxic, narcissistic bloodline I had severed her from. I pushed my chair back and stood up, the strength in my legs, a daily grounding reminder of my victory. I walked around the massive desk and knelt down, opening my arms. Emma let go of Rachel's hands and rushed forward, throwing her tiny arms around my neck with a joyous squeal. I lifted my daughter into the air, holding her securely against my chest, breathing in the sweet, clean scent of her hair. I carried her over to the towering windows, looking out at the sprawling, magnificent city I had conquered. Below us, the world moved at a frantic, chaotic pace. But up here in the empire I had built with my own 2 hands, there was only absolute peace. I looked down at Emma's smiling face, feeling a profound, unshakable serenity settle deep within my bones. I had finally learned the ultimate truth of survival. True power was never found in the heat of anger, because anger eventually burns itself out. True power was found in absolute, unapologetic independence and the creation of impenetrable boundaries. I had burned the house of cards to the ground, and in its place, I had built a fortress for my daughter, ensuring that no one would ever have the power to break us again. The power of independence. The most profound lesson from this narrative is that true power does not stem from vindictive anger, but from absolute independence and impenetrable boundaries. When faced with devastating betrayal from those supposed to protect us, it is easy to become consumed by a desire for revenge. However, the protagonist's journey demonstrates that healing begins when we stop seeking validation from toxic environments. By severing ties with her abusers and channeling her pain into building her own empire, she ultimately reclaimed her narrative. We must all learn to walk away from tables where respect is no longer being served. Please share your own experiences of establishing difficult boundaries to protect your peace in the comments below.